Well, I'm excited about our next session, and I know that, again, I really regret that Mayor Landrieu's not here right now, because you could sense in his voice how pumped up he is about their efforts in this space here in New Orleans. In the news and our national political discourse as well, we're so often focused on the things that divide us. We talk about black versus white, urban versus rural, Republican versus Democrat, blue cities versus red states. As mayors, we are required to focus on serving our full community. In spite of what we hear as Americans, we all want the same thing. Get that legal pad out and write down the top 10 things that are most important to your family. I guarantee you that almost anyone can sign that list, regardless of race, creed, color, national origin. We want our children to have a bright future. We want economic opportunity. We want safe neighborhoods. As mayors and as a conference, we've often said that cities are the engines of this nation's economy driving us forward. We also recognize, just as Mayor Reed and Mayor Emanuel were just referencing with acute awareness, that we can't move forward efficiently while leaving members of our own communities behind. And as we continue to be these incubators for growth and economic opportunity, that gap is widening in our cities everywhere we go. So we have to chart a path forward for our cities that's truly equitable, focused on affordable housing, access to economic opportunity, closing inequality gaps, and building municipal governments that work to eliminate disparities that have existed for decades. In today's discussion, we're going to take a look at opportunities to unite our communities and cities across racial and economic lines, and how equity as a framework for policymaking can shift the national discussion away from urban versus rural, or blue cities versus red states, and towards our common goals and our common needs. It's a pleasure to introduce Angela Glover Blackwell to some of you, and obviously to have Judy Reese Morse here. As we move forward with this discussion, there's no one better than the CEO and founder of PolicyLink, Angela Glover Blackwell, to help us here. She is a leading voice on the movement for equity in America. In 1999, she founded PolicyLink, an organization that has gained national prominence in the movement to use public policy to improve access and opportunity for all low-income people and communities of color, particularly in the areas of health, housing, transportation, and infrastructure. In addition to authoring many articles on the intersection of race, culture, and class, Ms. Blackwell also serves on many prominent boards, including the Children's Defense Fund, founded by South Carolina native Marion Wright Edelman. We also have with us Judy Reese Morse, Deputy Mayor for Citywide Initiatives here in New Orleans. Judy has worked with Mayor Landrieu for over 10 years and has led the development of several initiatives to the Mayor's office, including Equity New Orleans, the city's comprehensive strategy for increasing equity in municipal government. Please join me in welcoming Angela and Judy.
Thanks very
Use your
much.
microphone.
Thanks very much. It's such an honor to be here and to talk with you. I must say, in my work, working all across the country, I come in contact with mayors and people who work in local government all the time. And the one thing I'm struck by is the divides, the partisan divides, just don't come up that much. Because when I'm talking to mayors, they're always concerned about the well-being of the people who live in their cities. They're concerned about the economic vitality and the growth of their communities. They're concerned that everybody can participate and prosper. And I view that as the work that we have been doing at PolicyLink for nearly 20 years now. Our mission is to lift and advance everybody so that everybody can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. We say that we are a research and action institute advancing racial and economic equity. And when I use the term equity, I mean just what I said, just and fair inclusion into a society in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. As we think about these issues, It's so often that we separate out the issues of people, what it is that we need for people to be educated, for people to be healthy, for people to be ready to take jobs, from the issues of zoning and transportation and economic development. The idea of equitable development, which I'm going to be talking about with you today, is really to be able to integrate all of those things. It's not just equity alone, not just economic development, but equitable development. And the possibilities within equitable development have become more urgent than ever. The idea of equitable development is to develop in ways in which we consciously integrate the needs of people with the needs of place. That we don't just do a job training program over here and plan a transportation system over there, but we think about the people who have to get to their jobs as we're planning the transportation system. We don't just think about economic development and try to attract businesses and then lament the fact that we're looking like we're on the uptake in a city, but yet the same people are being left behind. We're thinking about the people who have been left behind when we start planning the businesses that we want to attract so that we're having people in that pipeline. These kind of issues have always been there as something to pick up and to move on, but we're at a moment in which the challenges of the economy and the demographic shifts that are happening all across the nation are really going to drive how we think about development going forward. We know that economic development is an issue, and we know that demographic change is happening. I wanted to show you something, which I guess I'm going to be able to show you. Yes? Well, I can certainly tell you, if I can't show you, that we have known that by 2044, the majority of all people in the country will be people of color. What many people don't know is that since the summer of 2012, the majority of all babies born have been of color. That we perhaps know that the majority of young children under 5 are of color. But just this week, the census came out with new data, the majority of all children under 10 are of color. By the end of 2019, we're almost in 18 now. By the end of 2019, the majority of all children 18 and under will be Latino, African American, Native American, Asian, or some combinations, other. The majority of all children under 18 will be of color. By 2030, the majority of the workforce will be of color. And so by the time we get to 2044, we will have felt like a nation in which the majority are of color for some time. What people may not know is in the last census, 92% of all growth in this nation was due to people of color. And the majority of that growth is due to births, not to immigration. And so when we think about the future of the nation, we have to accept that the fate of the nation is now dependent on what happens with people of color. And cities have been at the forefront of this demographic shift. And so it's going to be up to cities to model for their regions, for their states, and for the nation how it is that we build this fully inclusive society. And so this idea of equitable development, making sure that we're developing in ways that integrate people in place, that consciously reduce disparities, that make sure that when we're pursuing the development process that we're looking for triple bottom lines, economic returns for sure, returns that help the environment, but equity returns as well. And in order to do that, we have to pay attention to the fourth principle of equitable development, which is integrating the voice and the wisdom of the people who have been left behind into the planning and strategies as we go forward. Now, when we think about this, one of the areas that is really so clearly ready for it is economic opportunity. I am quite familiar with New Orleans. PolicyLink had the honor of being invited here after Katrina to help to make sure that equitable development would guide the rebuilding of the Gulf. But more recently, we've had a relationship with New Orleans around NOLA for Life, that we all admired the way that this city took a look at what was happening in terms of young black men dying on the streets of New Orleans and said they were going to do something about it. But paying attention to the data, not being content to work on that end of the problem that was most heartbreaking, they also saw there was something underneath that, and it was the absence of connection to jobs, connection to the economy. 52% of black men in this city were without work. And so we also worked with New Orleans to think about, well, where are the economic opportunities? Who's creating jobs? Who's going to be creating jobs into the future? Anchor institutions. And then look around the country to say, what are the exciting ideas to be able to make sure that people who are too often left behind are not in the process of growth? And we found all kinds of examples that we were able to look at together. And I am so proud of the work that New Orleans has done to make sure that we're not just saving the lives of these young men, but we're connecting the economic opportunity, connecting their families, connecting their regions. And they've been able to bring that 52% down to 44. It's very exciting. That is an example of thinking about economic opportunity at the same time that you're thinking about people who've been left behind. There was some conversation earlier, I think it was the mayor of Chicago, talking about infrastructure. And thinking about infrastructure, those investments are just ripe for equitable development. Minneapolis-St. Paul, as it was developing its light rail, the first plans were just skipping right over the low-income black community, and that was the plan until the community said, oh no, we have businesses here that could benefit from the light rail. We have people here who are isolated from jobs and opportunity. And through negotiations, they came up with a new plan that actually connects the businesses that are along that corridor in low-income communities of color and consciously connecting low-income people of color to opportunities throughout the region, doing the infrastructure at the same time, developing those things that help people to be able to build their skills. In Philadelphia, looking at their water situation, the stormwater runoff, they were able to come up with a $2.5 billion plan over 25 years to be able to get the return for green infrastructure, but also connecting young people who need work to be able to be ready for those jobs, and particularly focusing on those who had barriers to work. So the economic opportunities from infrastructure and economic development offer a tremendous opportunity to be able to invest in making sure people are not left behind. Another issue that is so important is housing, and I've heard that mentioned this morning as well. Not just do we know that people ought to be able to live in decent housing. One of the things we know in this nation is that where you live is a proxy for opportunity. You tell me what your address is, and I can tell you way too much about your prospects, including how well you'll live and how long you'll live, not to mention whether or not you live near a good school, near jobs, near public transit that can connect you to jobs. Whether if you're lucky enough to own a home, I can tell you whether you have any value in that home that you could pull out in time of an emergency or a health crisis. And so since we know that housing is more than housing, thinking about how to connect people to opportunity through housing is essential. San Francisco, a place where we know they're turning their attention to the affordable housing issue way too late. I admire the way that they are doing it. The big project going on in the Bayview Hunters Point, the Navy Yard, and the community recognized that this was going to be a big investment, and through negotiation, they were able to negotiate that 32% of the housing built would be affordable, with much of it deeply affordable, 30% of median income, 32%. But they went beyond that because we know this issue of displacement is so crucial, to make sure that they consciously reached out to find existing residents and people who had been displaced and offer them that affordable housing first. One of the strategies that they used was actually to hire a search firm to be able to go out and find people so that they would have this opportunity, and helping people who were feeling precarious to be able to secure housing in that arena. So we know that this can make a difference, but when we think about trying to fight the forces of displacement that are often associated with gentrification, we often are creating affordable housing without paying attention to increasing the incomes of the people who are there so they can afford housing. In this development, $8.5 million went into job training programs. Oh, are they? So these slides just really make the point that I already told you about. That one shows that 92% of the growth has happened is due to people of color, and this looks at growth from 2010 through 2040, and the only places where people of color are not adding to the growth are where you see red, and you can hardly find the red in that map. There's very little. If I go back to the one before that, you see the demographic change that I talked about. It goes all the way out, I think, to 2050, but the majority change happens in 2044. I wanted to move on to talk about food and access to food, because this is another area in terms of food systems, grocery stores, farmers markets, where we can make such a difference. There are so many communities where there is nothing happening economically in communities, and that includes no grocery stores. You've seen this story over and over again. When I go to cities that I'm unfamiliar with, I know if I find myself in an area of town where there are no grocery stores, that I have found the low-income Black community. I could tell you with my eyes closed and not see any people, and when I open them, that's what's there. This is an old story. The good news is that for the past 10 years, there's been a real explosion of being able to address that problem. One of the things that has existed now for a number of years at the federal level is the Healthy Food Financing Initiative. It came about, though, because of work that had happened in Pennsylvania back in 2004 when Governor Rendell put $30 million in an economic stimulus package to be able to get more grocery stores in underserved communities. It was very successful in Pennsylvania. The people who did it in Pennsylvania joined with PolicyLink. We took it to the Obama administration. We were able to get the Healthy Food Financing Initiative that now has more than $1 billion out in communities, helping to attract grocery stores. Many of them are independent grocers, but also helping corner stores and even liquor stores carry fresh fruits and vegetables by having the refrigeration that they need for that, helping farmers markets, encouraging urban agriculture, and being able to help to not only solve one of the health problems, lack of access to fresh fruits and vegetables, but to begin to create economic activity into communities, beginning to connect rural communities to urban communities and build those connections and provide the city supports that are needed for those things to thrive. This kind of equitable development, which I'm just skimming over the surface, our tagline at PolicyLink is lifting up what works, so that if you go on our website, you'll see oodles of examples. What we're trying to do is to use those examples to encourage mayors and others to be able to take these things to scale, because we have to. We're at a point where we have a coming together of two major issues. One of the defining things about this moment is inequality, economic inequality. The antidote to that inequality is equity, because we now know that inequality has become toxic. It's not just the inequality, but it's the inequality that is hollowing out the middle class, baking in poverty, making it harder for people to be able to move up the economic ladder. We also know that that inequality hurts growth. There's been an international study of 100 countries that found for every 10% decrease in inequality, there was a 50% lengthening in the period of growth. Manuel Pastor and Chris Benner in California have done similar research looking at the 100 largest regions, and they see a similar pattern. We have to do something about inequality if we're going to have sustained growth. And if we're going to have growth in this country, we have to build on its greatest asset, which is its diversity. People often wring their hands over this shifting demographics, but here's some information. The median age for people who are white in this country is 43. The median age for people who are Latino, the fastest growing group among people of color, is 28. And so we are continuing to be a young country as other places worry about that young country. People who are Latino, Asian, and African American are 3 times as likely to start businesses as people who are white. 3 times as likely. We continue to have a deep, rich entrepreneurial spirit in a nation that is dependent upon it. And what could be more exciting in a global economy than to have people in your communities, in your towns, in your regions who are connected to the globe by language, by culture, by kinship? And so it is an extraordinary asset, and we have to start treating that diversity as an asset and thinking with everything we do, how do we build on that asset? How do we reduce disparities? How do we use equitable development as a way to develop and grow and make sure that we're bringing the workforce, bringing the talent, bringing everybody that we need as we do so? I am well aware that there is some skepticism that investing in one group takes away from another. It's just not true. Equity is not a zero-sum game. And the way that I try to demonstrate that is through the imagery of the curb cuts, those curb cuts in every one of your cities and towns at every corner that allow you to be able to cross the street without obstruction. Those curb cuts are there because of the advocacy of people with disabilities in wheelchairs. But how many times have you been pushing a stroller and been so glad you didn't have to pick that contraption up? How many times have workers had their burden eased, pushing carts and pulling wagons? It even saves lives because it's been proven in study after study that those curb cuts orient people to cross at the corner. As an example of when you solve problems for those who are most vulnerable with specificity and nuance, the benefits cascade to everyone. There are other examples of that. Seat belts started off advocacy for children, to keep children safe. How many lives have been saved? Not smoking in public places. It started off the advocacy of flight attendants on airplanes, and it cascaded. And I always say the gold standard of the curb cut effect is the GI Bill. And while it excluded many people who were black, so it wasn't a universal boom for everyone, I don't think that anyone can argue with the fact that the GI Bill made the white middle class through education and housing opportunities that cascaded out. And so it is the same now. We have to take these steps to be able to make sure all can participate and prosper. It means going to the most vulnerable. It means paying attention, coming up with nuanced strategies, and then seeing that those strategies will go to everyone. We were talking about opiate addiction earlier. We know that we had the crack epidemic. We're looking at people who are isolated from the economy. That struck first in black and brown communities. It is an example, if you pay attention to those who are most vulnerable, with nuance, specificity, and targeting, the benefits will go to everyone. We could have gotten in front of this. We could have already had a system in place. We don't have it, but we're going to get it, and we're going to be able to stand on it going forward. I believe that equitable development is the best way for mayors to figure out how to bridge all of the divides and to allow the places where they are providing leadership to lead the nation. Thank you.
Amen.
I have been so pleased with the partnership that we've had with New Orleans, and I wondered if Judy could tell us some about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela, and we are so grateful to you for the work that you've helped us to do here in New Orleans and the work that PolicyLink is doing across the country. Here in New Orleans, Mayor Landrieu has, since 2010, focused specifically on closing the gaps. He has said from the very beginning that the future of New Orleans is based on her ability to be able to have everyone in the city become involved in our growth and our development. And so we have from the very beginning used a data-driven approach to look at and learn more about those individuals who have not been participating fully in our city's economy, and also to look at how they have been dealing with the greatest challenges, whether it is living in poverty, being unemployed, being not fully educated, and dealing with health disparities. We know that not everyone in New Orleans has the same opportunity. And what Mayor Landrieu did, and along with our team in city government here in New Orleans, is to be very intentional about not only learning as much as we can about the gaps that separate us, but also then coming up with strategies that speak to closing those gaps. We started, as Angela referred to earlier, by focusing on the murder rate among young African American men between the ages of 16 and 24. That is what all of the data took us to. We came up with what we call our comprehensive strategy, NOLA for Life. It focuses on law enforcement, prevention, intervention, and rehabilitation. 30 programs with almost 20 community partners, all strategically tied together to provide a comprehensive response to the murder rate here in New Orleans. We launched this initiative in 2012, and since that time, we have seen a 25% decrease in the murder rate in the 5-year period since we launched NOLA for Life as compared to the 5 years prior to the existence of NOLA for Life. Angela told you that in doing that work, we quickly got to looking at employment as it relates to African American men in New Orleans. And that startling data point of 52% of African American men who were looking for work, as well as those who were unemployed, just a shocking, shocking data point, them not being able to participate in the economy here in New Orleans. And so we had to come up with a strategy to address that. We have formed what we call the Network for Economic Opportunity that focuses on employment, but it also focuses on procurement, and a strategy that works with anchor institutions here in New Orleans to make sure that we can, again, intentionally focus on a specific strategy that will speak to that particular part of our work. The figure has dropped from 52% to 44%, and we continue to do that work and look to grow that work and increase that effort. We've also looked at a number of other areas, whether it's our work in criminal justice, our criminal justice reform work, whether it is our work to address health disparities here in New Orleans. We have been looking across city government to address a number of issues. Affordable housing has been a big body of work for us. But when we got to it all, as we looked across all of these bodies of work, and I would suggest that they have all seen a great deal of success here in New Orleans, we wanted to make sure, since this mayor will not be mayor forever, and every mayor who will serve in the city of New Orleans will have no more than 8 years, that we needed to make sure that there was a foundation that was in place so that city government would have a practice of equity with a focus on racial equity because of all of the data that Angela has shared with you about where we're going as a country. Here in New Orleans, 69% of the people who live in this city are people of color. And so we know that we have got to pay attention to the issue of race. We can't run away from it. As Mayor Landry says, you can't go over it, you can't go under it, you can't go around it. You've got to go right through it. And that's what we've tried to do here in New Orleans. That really led us to what we call Equity New Orleans. And I think all of you should have a booklet in front of you that really lays out a process that we went through with the people of New Orleans, with every sector represented in the city of New Orleans, to really come up with a formal strategy so that city government can practice racial equity in policy development, program creation, and in city service delivery. That booklet will have a lot of information to you, and it will lay out the formal strategy, but it is a process that will allow the people of New Orleans to be very active and very engaged in how government does its work. And of course, the idea is that the private sector will follow. We know because of the work that PolicyLink has done, helping us to look at the situation of equity in New Orleans, that billions of dollars have been left on the table because of the gap, because of the disparities based on race here in New Orleans. And so we are working hard as a city to understand this issue of equity more. Government will become a place that practices racial equity on a regular basis. I believe the private sector here in New Orleans will follow that lead and begin to understand what that looks like on the private side. And we believe that this is the foundation that will help New Orleans to grow and to develop at the rate that it should. Finally, I'll say that in 2018, New Orleans will celebrate its 300th anniversary, and Mayor Landrieu has really challenged all of us in New Orleans to think about the first 300 years of our existence, and then to think about what the next 300 years can be like. And if we can get this right, if we can be honest about our past, honest about where we have not done things right, honest about who has suffered the most because of the times that things have not been the way that they should be, that we are moving in the direction of being able to set a beautiful foundation for what the next 300 years can be. And with the demographic changes that are coming and the country changing the way that it certainly is, we think that New Orleans has a shot to be a model for the rest of the country as it relates to the practice of equity in government. So I'm really glad to be here on behalf of Mayor Landrieu to talk to you about this work, and I know that we want to get into a discussion about what can happen in other cities.
Thank you so much. Could you put the slides up again? Is it possible? Can you put the slides up again? All right. Whenever it happens, it'll be fine. Just
Sooner rather than later.
yeah. I wondered if there were any questions. I'm happy to take them, but I must say, that having looked into some of what you were doing, I had a couple of
taking is my
questions.
job, but it's okay.
I'm just so
I'm just
sorry
okay.
about that.
I'm just joking. You're on a roll. I love it. Go for it.
Just too much in charge. In looking at some of the things that are happening in your cities, though, I had some curiosity. Some of that curiosity was about Gary, Indiana, because I know there's a Gary for life, and I wondered from Mayor Wilson Freeman if any of these issues are resonating with you. But I see a question there, which you might want to follow.
No, please. Gary for life, please.
Well, they say that imitation is the best form of flattery, and so Mayor Landrieu was kind enough, along with his team over maybe 2 years ago, to allow us to spend some time in New Orleans as we grappled with the challenges around an increase in crime and the understanding that this was, that a comprehensive approach was needed. And we have initiated Gary for Life. You know, we didn't even deviate from the name. We just put our city in it. And I think that's really what this organization is about, looking at best practices, trying to implement them. And we've met with some success. We've had, I think, as many cities have seen over the course of the last year, a real increase in violent crime. But I think that the real benefit of Gary for Life speaks to two of the things and that you all raised, and thank you both for great presentations. I have to just say that. I'm big fans of both of you. But, you know, first that you have to really focus if you're going to deal with something in the criminal justice arena. The thing about NOLA for Life was that they focused on murder. And it wasn't that there weren't other violent crimes, it wasn't that there weren't property crimes that had an impact, but they raised up and had the courage to raise up murder because of, one, the permanent nature and the disparate impact it was having among young men of color. The other thing, and this goes to the concept of equitable development, and you know, when cities are doing well, or when certain sectors of cities are doing well, it takes a lot of courage and leadership to say, yeah, you know, they're doing well in this part of the community, but what about this part? And you know, we have done that in the city of Gary, and we've met with some resistance, because people have, quite frankly, said, well, you know, we're not really worried about them. They're gonna do what they're going to do, in fact. But, you know, it's important for us to push back in a very respectful, but in a very clear way to say, yes, it does matter. And, you know, what I always tell people is that my best formula for reducing the rate of poverty in the city of Gary isn't to dissipate it by moving more people in. I mean, that's one of the ways you can do it, but it's really to provide opportunities for those people who are in the city and who have been in the city, and to allow them to climb out of poverty and ultimately participate fully in the economy and in the quality of life in the city.
Thank you.
Mayor Soglin.
I'm not sure that our city is much different than others in that when you look at the responsiveness of city government, the people who know how to take advantage of it, whether it's a specific development or zoning issue or allocations at budget time, are going to principally be white, and they're going to be middle class. The real challenge is engagement and placemaking within low-income communities, which are oftentimes communities of color. And historically, because of what has happened in our cities over the years, there's a cynicism, there's a mistrust, and there's a sense of abandonment that we don't see that kind of activism and participation in placemaking. Saul Alinsky used to say, don't do for people what they can do for themselves. I had a discussion about this recently with Marshall Gans and with Fred Kent. We spent 3 hours discussing this. And one of the things we were looking at is, can placemaking be, in effect, a community organizing tool to activate, not just in that one instance, but in the whole future of the neighborhood. Could you comment and tell us what you think about how to make the concepts that you're talking about? I mean, let's just take the example of the transportation. In so many of our cities, the transportation system is inequitable as it relates to race and color.
Yes, I'd be happy to comment on that. When I talked about equitable development, and I gave 4 principles, the first was integrate people in place. The second was consciously reduce disparities. The third was look for triple bottom lines. And the fourth was engage with the people who need to be engaged in order for the benefits to go to them. Community engagement, absolutely essential. I have found that community engagement can happen any place. What it takes is being sincere in reaching out to people, not just so you can say, I had a meeting and we had 20% people of color come, but to put on the frame that I offered, which is, it is essential for the growth and the economic well-being of our communities that we develop in ways in which everybody can participate. And if we do that, we will all benefit. So that if people feel that it's to your benefit for everybody to be engaged, because you need their wisdom, you need their participation, that's a different kind of invitation. It's one thing to say, I want to make sure the room is diverse. It's another to say, I can't do what I want to do if you don't come and if I don't learn from you. When the Sustainable Communities Initiative started under the Obama administration, we worked hard as a national policy group to make sure that there were equity criteria in it. But we did not stop there. We reached out to our vast network around the country of organizers and activists, and we had a series of webinars saying it's coming. This is how you get to the table. These are the issues you raise when you get to the table. We got money into that so that in Minneapolis, they spent $750 $250,000 through their Sustainable Communities initiative to be able to make sure there was authentic community engagement. But reaching out to people, equipping people so that when they're in the room, they can really participate, and backing them up afterwards. I have seen on the transportation issue a real transformation in the way people are thinking of it. Another thing PolicyLink does is we run the National Equity Transportation Caucus. And what we have done is said that transportation is not just something for the engineers and the planners, but this is about health. This is about civil rights. This is about jobs. This is about community connectivity. It's about democracy. And bringing groups in to raise those questions, understanding they are essential. I also think that money and planning and getting leaders into visible positions can make a difference. In Oakland, California, which is where I live, PolicyLink is a national organization that's based in Oakland. We have a terrible displacement problem brewing and real in Oakland. Working with community groups and the mayor's office, we came up with a 12-point roadmap to do something about affordable housing. Some of it had to get on the ballot, some of it the mayor could do, some of it the city council had to do. We've moved through 8 of them, including 2 that got on the ballot. One that is going to bring $100 million for housing through an infrastructure bond. And the community, it was a door-to-door process. So you're right about everything that you said. There are many places where when you send the opportunity out there, you have one thing in mind, but the people you have in mind don't come. The other thing you're right about is that people have not been organized and supported to be able to participate. Those are easily surmountable issues. If people know this is about them, they will come. And if you have the support and the underpinnings that are needed for participation, and if people know that they are going to be listened to, they will be there. Yeah.
Just to give an example of what we've done here in New Orleans to that point, we conducted a year-long process to get to the city's first ever formal equity strategy. And a huge part of that process was all about community engagement, not only engaging residents, but also engaging employees at City Hall. And so we had multiple community listening sessions. We were overwhelmed by the response that we received. Angela is exactly on point. When you extend a sincere invitation to residents to come and to participate on the front end of a discussion that they know will influence the development of policy or the creation of a strategy, it makes a huge difference in their willingness to be able to contribute and share their thoughts and their ideas. We also did focus groups, and we did hundreds and hundreds of one-on-one interviews. We wanted to make sure that it was clear that we were not only interested in what they had to say, getting their ideas for what equity will mean to them, their visions for equity in city government and the city at large, but also helping them to understand that we were going to develop our formal strategy based on what they said. So if you turn to page 26 in your booklet, you'll see some of the data collection, and you'll see overwhelmingly what people said was an indication of what equity means to them. City policies and practices was the #1 expression of equity. We thought that it was going to be jobs, and jobs rates highly for certain, but we were surprised to find out that people understanding what the city is doing, what the policies are, what the programs and practices are going to be, them having access to that information and being able to participate in the creation of those policies and programs was the #1 expression of equity. And so it is true. We found it to be true over the course of a year, and we were overwhelmed with the very positive response that we got across all racial groups, all parts of the city, once we announced the strategy, because residents saw that we took what they said, we built it into the strategy, and now government will do its work based on what they said.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Houston.
Thank you, thank you. Let me ask, in many ways, generally speaking, cities can be doing very, very well. There are certain parts of cities that are booming, growing, developing, and all of that. There are also in the same cities, areas, communities that have been overlooked, under-resourced, underserved for decades. when you speak of public affordable housing, do you advocate placing affordable housing in other parts of the city where they are doing very well? Do you advocate that the communities that have been overlooked, under-resourced, underserved for decades, affordable housing be placed there? What is your position in terms of eliminating the disparity and moving the city forward?
It is a complex question, and I have been involved in this discussion on numerous occasions in Washington, D.C., and in communities all across the nation. I think that what we really are going for in terms of understanding the role that housing can play in creating regional equity, and that means that everybody in the region is able to fully participate and benefit from what's there and contribute, is that we need to make sure that where we have communities of opportunity, and I think we all know what communities of opportunity are because we look for them if we have children when we're buying homes. We want the schools to be good. We want the neighborhoods to be safe. We want to be able to connect to work, either because it's nearby or transit can get us there. We know what communities of opportunity look like. Communities of opportunity should have affordable housing. They should have different levels of affordable housing, and we have to get over this NIMBYism, this not in my backyard, this greediness that we seem to have developed as a nation in terms of just wanting to hold everything close and not share it. We got to get over that, and it's up to our political leaders to help communities get over it. That is one strategy, and we know that that is a strategy that can work. Also, we know that many communities in cities now are going to come back. I have always said to community development actors that if you start to do a redevelopment project, assume success from day one. You're doing it to bring this community back. Assume success and secure affordability before you do all of these things that improve the community. If you assume success, you don't end up with a problem of gentrification and displacement because you will have baked in affordability. So that is true in places like Oakland and San Francisco and Boston and Chicago and all kinds of places that are rapidly coming back. And you can look at a community, maybe nobody wants to live there now, but people will want to live there next year. Bake in affordability. The other thing is there are communities that it's not clear that they're going to be coming back anytime soon, but people are attached to them. The sadness about that is that people are in those communities because of historical racism and structural racism and continuing racism. I teach a course at NYU on race, class, and American cities, and the students always, there is a gasp when I have them look at the red line maps and then look at the areas of concentrated racial poverty to see that they're exactly the same. It is sad that that is why people are in those communities, but people are resilient, and they make a space where they make a way out of no way. And people have churches and institutions and history and legacy in communities. And I understand that some people want to see investments in those communities. They want to be able to stay. If you're working with community groups and not just dropping things in, but working with groups, working with residents to be able to plan how it is that we're going to invest in those communities, that can happen too. And so my answer is it all has a place. Investing in communities that are in deep distress has a place. Securing affordability in places that are, or you know they are, going to be gentrifying, that has a place. And making sure that places that are already rich with opportunity are not closed off to people who desperately need that opportunity. Do it thoughtfully and planfully.
And that's the reason why I raised the question, because what is happening now, even for example, like with HUD, is that they've taken the position, at least in the past, for example, that cities shouldn't build affordable housing in areas that have been underserved, under-resourced. Many of these happen to be low-income minority areas where many of us grew up and were reared and, in my case, still live. If we are not allowed to build housing in these historical minority communities, they will eventually die. Schools will close. Churches will go. Grocery stores will never come. And so my position that I have taken in the city of Houston to HUD and to others is that the answer is not to build affordable housing. I shouldn't have to say to children and families in historical low-income minority areas that the only way that they can be a part of the economic success of this country is that I have to move them from their neighborhoods and place them across town. The answer is to invest in those communities in a real, tangible way and build complete communities where they become communities of opportunity.
That's right.
But if HUD and others take the position that we cannot build, as they have taken in Houston, that we cannot build in communities in which, for example, I was born and reared and still live, then that policy will kill those communities and close those schools. And I think as mayors, we need to be very sensitive. We need housing all over the place, in every sector. But a policy that says you cannot build in these communities because they are so burdened, well, they've been burdened because they've been overlooked.
If I might comment, because I'm going to have to leave, I have to get a flight, but you have just put the issue squarely there, and I've been in these conversations at HUD and in communities, and actually was a part of the redesign of the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule, so I'm very familiar with this. I think that what you, in your fullness, described is exactly what needs to happen. Not just affordable housing in communities that are poor and have always been poor, but investments in schools and transportation and grocery stores and linkages to work, that the community has to become a community of opportunity. And unfortunately, when the only resources that come in are for affordable housing, they don't help to build communities of opportunity. They concentrate poverty in places where poverty is already concentrated. And so this notion of building a community of opportunity where people already live is a powerful one, and we need to figure out a way to do that. And we need to make sure that families that want to be able to move to communities of opportunity have the support and the access to do so. We are a rich country. We are a rich country. We are not a poor country, and we need to stop acting like one and invest in the people who are going to be the future, or the country will suffer because we have failed to do so.
Thank you.
I'm so
Amen.
sorry I have to go. I
No.
could stay forever
No.
to talk with you all.
No, thank you. It's a wonderful final word. Thank y'all. All right. And safe travels. And Judy, thank you so much. Well, we're going to shift into an exciting discussion that I've heard on the lips of many of us over the last couple of days. What's needed to build modern workforces and discuss the impact of globalization and technology on the American economy and American workers. So I want to invite our next team of presenters up here. Of course, as mayors, one of our most significant responsibilities is ensuring that our communities are economically thriving and that our employment rates stay high. In order to do that, we have to promote job creation and workforce development so our residents are equipped for the jobs that are available in each of our cities that may go unfilled today. That can be a huge challenge when in our globalized economy, jobs are outsourced elsewhere, when new technologies like self-driving vehicles threaten to take many jobs away, or when those in our communities don't have the skill set to be competitive for the growing job markets in technology. This session hopes to tackle those questions head on and explore how we can be preparing our communities for the changes already upon us and those that come in the near future. I want to introduce the panel. Our moderator is Amy Liu. Amy is the Vice President and Director of the Metropolitan Policy Program at Brookings, and Adeline and Alfred Johnson Chair in Urban and Metropolitan Policy. She's a national expert in cities and metropolitan areas, adept at translating research and insights into action on the ground. Deborah Elam recently retired from her role as president of the GE Foundation and chief diversity officer at GE, where she led the global philanthropic efforts to tackle some of the world's most critical challenges across health, education, and skills development. She also oversaw the efforts to embrace diversity and create an environment where all GE employees can thrive and contribute to the company's success in the global economy. We also have South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg. Pete brings years of experience working economic development and energy into his work as mayor, in which he runs a cutting-edge and transparent administration focused on strengthening the local economy and retaining and attracting businesses to his city. Michael Chewy is a partner at the McKinsey Global Institute, directs research on the impact of long-term disruptive technology trends such as artificial intelligence, data and analytics, and social technologies. He served in the high-tech, media, and telecom industries on strategy, innovation, and product development, IT, and marketing. With that, I'm going to call on our moderator, Amy Liu from the Brookings Institute. Amy, all yours.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon. It's great to see everyone. Thank you, Mayor. It's a real honor to be here and to be part of this conference's effort to take some action on the agenda for the future. I'm going to talk about employment and economic security in a time of enormous churn. And as one mayor said to me during the break, this conversation about employment and economic security absolutely connects with a lot of the conversations you've already had over the course of today. Because without employment, it affects the opiate crisis. It affects people's ability to afford health care, and there's no doubt we need to think about employment in a diversifying economy. So I'm really pleased to set the stage for this important discussion, which is about the impact of globalization and technology on cities and workers, before then opening up the floor to the panelists next to me on my left and to all of you. Now, I call this managing disruption, and the big market forces today, such as rapid digitization, will create opportunity, and it will also destroy opportunity. So success for many of us at the local level will be defined by how well we evolve and adapt our existing policies and programs to help our workers really navigate and be better off in this period of disruptive change. Now, this is a big topic, so what I'm going to do is limit my opening talk to just some 3 points. First, I want to talk about why cities need to be proactive about preparing for disruption, which requires understanding the nature and scale of the change that's underway. Second, I do want to dig into one particular facet of how technology is changing the labor market, and that is how demand for skills is changing. And third, I want to talk about what strategies mayors can use to help workers make successful transitions in this 21st century economy. So let's talk about the disruptive forces that cities face, and you know many of these. Cities now confront a whole set of forces that are not new, but they are accelerating, and they're hyper interrelated. Disruptive technologies and globalization together are upending whole industries. They are dislocating workers, destabilizing some older industrial cities. Rapid urbanization is now being accompanied by deepening poverty, which all of you have talked about, and it's also widening disparities between cities because tech innovation is now continues to favor mostly the coastal markets. Meanwhile, our workforce is aging and diversifying, as Angela just reminded us, which is creating a lot of tensions in our communities about how we help older white workers and younger populations of color. And frankly, I think of these macro forces as assets. Not just disruptors. You know, the places that are going to thrive in the 21st century economy are going to have to be globally integrated. They are going to be tech savvy. They are going to be hyper urban. They will be diverse and multicultural and multi-ethnic. So for mayors, I think it's really important and incumbent of all of you to play a role in ensuring that these market forces can result in inclusion rather than dislocation and inequality. So now, I want to talk a little bit about the voter backlash on trade in the last election. While global trade is certainly vital to many metropolitan economies, it also led to substantial job losses and extended periods of unemployment for many workers. More than 2 million workers have received federal adjustment assistance since 1994 as a result of being displaced by trade, with 71% of those workers located in large and small metropolitan areas. I put this slide up here as an object lesson, which is that we cannot repeat our mistake in underestimating the impact of disruptive forces on people and towns, particularly because technology is going to be even a more ubiquitous disruptive force. Now let's dig deeper into one piece of that technology change, which is how that's affecting the skills composition in cities. Now, my colleague Mark Miro is just completing some analysis on the changing digital requirements of jobs across all 100 metropolitan areas. So what we did was we examined the skills requirements of 545 distinct occupations, which make up about 91% of the U.S. job market. Now, a digital skill is defined as having two parts: the need to have specific knowledge in computer and electronics, and the frequent use of computers in your daily tasks. And then what we did was we ranked all the occupations along a composite digital score between 1 and 100. Now, obviously, a software developer has a high digital score, and meanwhile, personal care aides, restaurant workers, and cooks have a low score because they use very minimal technology, mostly relying on interpersonal skills and craft by hand. Now, this is what we found: that in 2002, more than half, or 55% of all U.S. jobs required low or minimal computer skills, and just 5% required high levels of computer literacy. But by 2016, just 14 years later, that skill requirement has dramatically shifted. Jobs with low digital skills have shrunk to now just 30% of all jobs, while 70% of jobs today require workers to have moderate to high digital literacy. And as you can see, this is shifting everything from administrative assistants to tool and die makers. Those jobs have fundamentally digitalized. And this trend holds particularly true for many of the occupations that serve as on-ramps to middle-class careers. And I know many of you focus on these positions. So in 2002, plumbers, firefighters, nurses, other jobs that serve as important stepping stones to jobs with good wages, these jobs require, little to moderate levels of computer knowledge. Look at that. Today, these occupations have significantly upskilled. Police officers, nurses, many of these jobs now use sophisticated software, apply electronic records, again requiring all of our workers to have middle to high computer literacy. Now, as our jobs digitalize, it's important to recognize that not all race and ethnic groups are equally represented within these occupations. So, Black and Hispanic Americans, shown in the colored bars here, you can see, are disproportionately employed in occupations that require only low levels of digital skills, which also tend to pay lower wages. And these include home health aides, truck drivers, landscapers. At the same time, Black and Hispanic Americans are less likely to be employed in the highly digital, higher-paying occupations like computer programmers, architects, engineers, managers, and doctors. So I'm going to talk more about what the strategy implications of this is for mayors and cities. I just want to reinforce that a lot of this forthcoming research is going to be available this fall, data for each one of your metropolitan areas. But what is clear to me is that the advent of new technology raises really profound questions about how we retrain existing workers and also prepare all new workers for jobs in this digital age. Now, as cities prepare workers for the demands of the new economy, we also need to have programs that address workers who have lost jobs, have been laid off, have not been able to enter the labor force with stable employment. We need effective approaches on helping workers get back on their feet in case of job disruption. So earlier this summer, Brookings released some novel new analytics to identify who is out of work in 130 large cities and counties. These 130 jurisdictions make up about half of the U.S. population. Now, the goal for us was to better understand who exactly is employed in our cities, and therefore it can help us determine whether or not our cities have the right mix of programs to get these workers into jobs. Now, we found there are 11.3 million prime-age working Americans in these 130 jurisdictions who do not have jobs but likely want to work. These numbers do not include retirees, students, people on disability insurance, stay-at-home parents. Now, that figure of 11.3 million is nearly 3 times higher than the official unemployment levels would tell you. In other words, rather than believe that we're at full employment with an average unemployment rate about 5% or less, we actually have 14% of our prime age workers who are jobless. So we think this reflects a much more accurate picture of who wants to work but isn't currently. Now, as a whole, this group shares some top-line characteristics, such as the fact that more than half of these jobless populations have low levels of education. Now, to help cities sort of understand the types of residents who are out of work in the communities, we categorize the out of work into 7 broad categories. So 3 groups, if you look at that top row, have low levels of education, meaning they have a high school diploma or less. But what's interesting is they are at different stages of the career trajectory. Some are young, some are in their middle of their prime age working years, some of them are nearing retirement. 2 groups have moderate levels of education, and some have high educations. So as you can imagine, this really affects whether or not we have the right strategies to get these people back into employment. Now, it's not a surprise that there's a lot of variation between jurisdictions about who is out of work. So let me just give you a couple examples. So in Atlanta, for instance, and this data is actually for Fulton County, there are 77,000 people who are out of work. The 2 largest segments are the following. 38%, see on that left bar there in the light blue, mostly African-American men between the ages of 25 to 55 with a high school diploma or less. The second largest category of people out of work in Atlanta or Fulton County is on the far right at 22%. This group is highly educated. They have college degrees. They're mostly white and mostly women. 70% of the unemployed are women, and those women, 30% of them, are actively looking for jobs right now but can't find them. Now, in the city county of Indianapolis, it's a little different. The largest share of the out of work, the 41%, skew older. They're from 35 to near retirement. They are less educated. More than half are women. Half are comprised of white workers, and 1/3 African American. For Phoenix, that 37% bar, which is your largest unemployed, and by the way, I know Mayor Giles is here. We have data for the rest of Maricopa County. Half of that are Hispanic women with limited English proficiency. So that just gives you a sense of, again, you can go to our website and take a look at the data for your community, but it gives you, again, a sense of who is out of work. So let me just close with this. In this disruptive era, how do mayors and cities help their residents gain a foothold then in this digital globalizing economy? So we would argue that on at least helping people prepare for the new demands in the global economy, there are 3 things we can do. First, we can train existing and new high-tech workers in those cutting-edge technologies, such as providing computer science classes in schools, on-the-job training in IT for existing workers, expanding digital certification programs. Second, we do think that we need to increase basic digital literacy for the most disadvantaged populations. And then lastly, we need to emphasize, training people in those, what we would call uniquely human capabilities, like adaptability, creativity, project planning, social skills that complement machine learning and tech. There's numerous studies that show that these soft skills will become more valuable in the digital age. And meanwhile, disruption means that workers may be vulnerable to periods of unemployment. So in parallel, our cities need to have a robust continuum of programs that help dislocated or jobless workers get back on the employment track, regardless of their age, regardless of where they are in their career trajectory, no matter their education level. So what we did was, in the report, identified 8 types of workforce interventions that range from school to work bridge programs, jobs and social enterprises, apprenticeships. In our website and our report, what you can do is there's a tool that helps you assess in your city whether or not which of these programs makes the most sense for the types of out-of-work jobless workers in your community. So in sum, I just think that mayors really need to continue to push the envelope on how do we help our workers keep pace with the demands of the changing economy while making sure there is a cushion for folks as they fall in and out of employment. And that's because at the end of the day, people will move in and out of the labor market, and we need to create that security for them. Thank you. And so what I want to do now is really turn to a really robust group of panelists who are going to go deeper on the extent of the disruption that we're seeing in our communities and what that means for our programs for mayors and all of your business, civic, and employer workers. So what I'm going to do is start with Michael Choi, who is a partner at McKinsey Global Institute. And what I wanted to ask him is, I just barely touched on this issue of technology and its impact on jobs. A lot of people have worried about automation and whether or not many jobs are going to be, workers are going to be displaced by automation, and this is something that Michael Choi has written a lot about. So what I want you to do was just give our mayors a sense of, should we be worried? Do we need to have a more nuanced view about the relevance of technology change and employment opportunities in the future?
Thanks, Amy. Thanks, mayors, for having me. I once had the honor of serving in a municipal government in the same state as Mayor Buttigieg, as Chief Information Officer of Bloomington, Indiana. Now I do a lot of research on the impact of long-term technology trends, including artificial intelligence, automation, and robotics. We published a report in January where we looked at not only every occupation in the economy, but all of the constituent activities within every occupation. Because our point of view is that in all of our jobs, we do different things which have a different propensity to be automated, different propensity for machines to be able to do that. We compared the current state of the art against a whole bunch of different technologies to all of the activities, over 2,000 of them that are listed in the Bureau of Labor Statistics that constitute all of the jobs in the economy, and found that 50%, about half of the time we pay people to work, they're in activities that could be automated by adapting currently demonstrated technologies. Now, in some sense, you might consider that extremely scary because you say, oh, tomorrow are we going to have 50% unemployment? The answer is no, because in fact, while I said in theory they could be automated by adapting currently demonstrated technologies, those of us who have built technology know it takes real time to do that. And then it takes time for technology to be adopted. So what we found looking at dozens of different technologies over the past century, it takes on the order of 8 to 28 years between the time that a technology is commercially available and the time it eventually reaches its plateau in adoption. So, we modeled a whole bunch of different scenarios, but basically what we found was the midpoint of all those scenarios, half of the things that we pay people to do aren't automated until 2055 or 10 presidential terms from now approximately. That said, while on a macro level, things might move slowly, as Amy points out, at a micro level, they can happen very quickly. They can, if it affects a single worker, that'll happen quickly. If it affects a single company that has to compete against another company that's using automation, that can happen very quickly. Now, fortunately, throughout American history, we have been able to change a double-digit percentage of what the labor force does within a matter of decades. The percentage of people in agriculture has gone from 40% in 1900 to 2% 70 years later. So that level of activity has happened, change has happened before. That level of disruption has happened before. But it didn't happen by accident. A series of smart, intelligent, thoughtful, and of course we fight about it to make this stuff happen, investments were made, things like universal secondary school. That didn't exist in 1900. And then the high school movement made sure that could happen so people could move from the farm to the factory, et cetera, move into cities. So the question is, what are the things that have to happen to make sure that we don't end up with mass unemployment? Because where I live in San Francisco, it's very sexy to talk about the universal basic income because the robots are going to come, they're going to take everybody's job, and we need to give people enough money so that they can just live and eat. Well, our point of view is that that is not an outcome we should be aiming for. Because what we need all of the robots working plus all the people working so that we have enough economic growth so the next generation has better lives than we do. In fact, I worry a little bit that, in fact, we won't adopt these technologies fast enough.
Right.
Half of the sources of our economic growth over the past 50 years are because more people have been working. We have people living longer, more women in the workforce, just more people in general. And in the next 50 years, that source of economic growth is about to disappear. So again, we need all the robots working as quickly as possible, plus we need all the people working. So a couple of things. One is implications of that. How do we accelerate the adoption of these technologies? Secondly, how do we allow people to transition to the new jobs and the new and additional work that will be created? We're doing some research now that will be published in a couple months, which show roughly that it is possible to create new demand for labor, even net of all the automation that's going on. So how do we make sure we go through those transitions and skills that Amy talked about?
Go ahead.
Just one other point. Finally, as we model this out, we do see a lot of the additional demand increasing income polarization. So there'll be a set of jobs that will pay very well. Much of the additional demand, while it will be fairly high skilled, at least currently, we don't pay very much for. So take a nurse, take a physician's assistant, take a teacher. And so I think we have to think about incomes as well. So creating the new labor demand. Secondly, how do we transition? By the way, portable benefits is another one. And then thirdly, how do we actually make sure that incomes pay?
Michael, I was just going to ask you as a follow-up question, do you see specific interventions that mayors and their local partners can do, both to maybe take advantage of the new jobs created by technologies or focus on transitions?
Yeah, well, I'll preface this by saying the McKinsey Global Institute never gives policy advice, but we will sometimes describe some policy options as we've seen what's happened. First of all, in terms of creating that, creating the actual demand, one of the demand drivers is infrastructure. And by the way, that produces fairly good incomes as well, but also paying for unpaid work. So childcare, for instance, right, which right now is work, but it's unpaid for. So I think there are a number of levers to make sure that you actually get the job creation that you need. On transition, there are lots of things we can do. You mentioned a number of levers in terms of education retraining. Notably, not just in the first 2 decades of somebody's life, but continuing on as well. Again, it's a very different model, but every Singaporean citizen and every Singaporean permanent resident has access to a training fund on an annual basis. Now that's a difficult thing from a fiscal standpoint, but just what's the thought about how can you make sure that people are continuing to retrain? And then thinking about incomes, I think there are a number of ways in which you can encourage people to work and supplement their incomes.
Great. So I now want to turn it over to Mayor Buttigieg. And first of all, when I was preparing for this panel today, I did some Google search, and I found that the mayor did a wonderful interview with Seth Meyers. So if you haven't checked out his late night appearance, you should. It was really good. One of the things I wanted to ask the mayor was the fact that South Bend is sort of the quintessential older industrial city that has weathered a lot of economic transition. So I wanted to know whether there's been some lessons from South Bend on how you were able to evolve your manufacturing economy during this age of major technological and global change.
Well, thank you. And I think it's probably helpful to do just a quick thumbnail scene setter about South Bend, because people who only know about our football team aren't aware that we were built not around education but industry. And we're very much a company town for Studebaker, producing cars until the last Studebaker was made in 1963. And so we really spent the last 50 years wrangling with this issue. And sometimes it's characterized as globalization. Sometimes it's seen more through the view of technology. Often it's understood as being part of trends that go beyond those two things. But a few things we've hit on that have worked for us, I think might be relevant in other places. The first, I think, is to avoid the two kind of poles of temptation, one of which is nostalgia, of believing that we can just turn back the clock. I know that's being sold to a lot of workers right now in some of the things that are being said about coal. And when I was running for mayor, there were a lot of people saying that what we need to do is get some version of Studebaker to come back. That we need another company to show up here and employ 20,000 people. And that lends itself to a somewhat discredited approach to economic development, which I call smokestack chasing, that often leads you down the path of buying jobs that aren't that sticky anyway. The other pole is doom, right? So saying that none of this is going to come back and not providing another answer. It was very important to us to establish that companies like Studebaker weren't going to come back. We're never going to have a single employer of 20,000 people. We don't want one, and the community can come back anyway. And the way we tried to demonstrate that is to point to the wins that we've got in a globalized or technologized economy. So for example, we've got a company that does friction welding. They make machines that are the size of a house. And they ship them all over the world. Now, they're only going to have about 200 jobs at that place, but those are going to be steady and good paying jobs. Equally importantly, they make, for example, the machines that are used by workers who make Ford automobiles in Mexico. So the workers making the cars are in Mexico, but the workers making the machines that those workers are going to use are in South Bend. And by illustrating stories like that, we're able to show our workers how they can win by moving up the value chain. In other words, it's not a question of are we going to do manufacturing or are we going to do technology? It's when we're doing manufacturing, how do we make sure it's higher technology? Another thing that I think is working for us that might sound a little cheap, but I just want to mention it, is in addition to the responsibility to cultivate job skills in our workers, we also just need to attract people who have the skills. Now, that might sound like zero-sum thinking, like all we're going to do is pick off workers from other geographies and get them to move to our community. But here's why I don't think that's actually the case. Much as we were talking about with some of the other conversations around equity, you're worse off if all of your skills around the U.S. are concentrated in the same areas. Whereas we can work to have a critical mass of people who may have acquired their skills somewhere else, settle in South Bend in order to work in a place like South Bend, and then share those skills. For example, we have somebody who is connected to the university, working in technology, who's created now a South Bend Code School, whose purpose is to teach coding skills to kids in the sort of 10 to 15-year-old age range. And by the way, not only doing it as an after-school program, but going into our juvenile detention center, where we find a lot of very intelligent, bored and traumatized kids, and giving them something to be proud of by having them create websites, some of which the city has now actually begun using. The last thing I want to mention just on the local front is that in order to do that, much as some of the approaches we talked to on health earlier this morning, you have to do some bank shots. In other words, it's not just about municipally sponsored skills programs. We have those. But it's also about things like placemaking, making sure we're the kind of place that the people who have those skills will want to come. And that has as much to do with your brew pubs as it does with your economic development program. And we found that fitting those two things together has really been fruitful for us as a city.
Yeah, that's great. As a follow-up, you opened your talk a little bit about messaging. So I want to come back to that. Where, and you, after the election, kind of stepped up a little bit at the national level. Where, the national rhetoric right now is that trade is bad, trade is a threat. I think a lot of workers do fear change right now in globalization and technology. What's the right way to frame change for the future of our communities, as well as just continuing to work on the policy piece of it?
So I think the key to that is demonstrating to workers that they have a role in a globalized economy other than that of victim. And unfortunately, media narratives aren't always helping us in this regard. But to me, what it comes down to is we've got to transcend the description of jobs as binary. There's most of the vocabulary, especially in the shallower areas of political coverage, treats jobs as just all that matters is do you have one or do you not have one. And what we've done with that kind of rhetoric, you can see its weakness just in what happened in the last election, right? Because what we had was the kind of electoral outcome, an economic anxiety election, that should take place when unemployment is rising and you're in a recession or a depression. And yet what happened was we had an economic anxiety election during a recovery when unemployment was falling. And we were actually close to statistical full employment, although you've demonstrated why statistical full employment isn't the whole story. So I think, first of all, looking a little bit deeper beyond do you have a job or do you not have a job, in two ways. First of all, understanding that there's more to the job than whether you have it in terms of its income, in terms of its security, and above all, in terms of its identity. And I think identity is the part that well-intentioned retraining programs miss. So just because on paper, a job with a similar level of education is going to have a similar level of pay, doesn't mean a guy who's been in a tool and die shop for 20 years can visualize himself working as a nurse. And if we don't account for that, our well-intentioned programs will actually never succeed because they won't align with how people view themselves and the role of work in their lives. The second thing I want to mention is that I think we need to learn, both in terms of quality of place and in terms of quality of a job, that there's a spectrum. Again, not that they're binary. And that's how I think we break out of the chicken and egg thinking of, okay, well, we need to have jobs so people will come here, but we need to have the right people so that the jobs will grow. What are we going to do? The reality is there's a spectrum between the least attractive job you're willing to take and your dream job. just like there's a spectrum between a place you're minimally willing to live in and a place you've always wanted to live in. And when you map those two things together, you begin to realize there are jobs so good you would move to Antarctica to do them. And there are communities so great you would work in a job you're way overqualified to do just for the chance to live there. And our job is to create as many jobs as we can that would want people to move to anywhere to do them, and to be the kind of community that people would accept any job at all just to get a toehold in our city. And if we start thinking of it in that three-dimensional way, I think we have a much better chance of growing in our communities, but also in terms of our national alignment of identity with work.
Great, thanks. We also have the benefit of having Deb Elam with us, and Deb is both a former Chief Diversity Officer at GE, so a major multinational company, but also the former head of a foundation. So she understands this issue about worker well-being from a corporate business and philanthropic perspective, and now has started a new company. But Deb, I thought it'd be helpful for you to bring a sort of your business perspective to this table. What do you see are things that companies as a whole can do to really prepare workers for the changing demands of the global economy?
Great. Oh. Thank you. Good afternoon. It's great. Oh, come on. We can do better than that. Good afternoon. It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and it's great to have what I'll call the 2 R's, being retired and still relevant. So let me talk a little bit. I spent a 30-year career in GE and have recently retired, as Amy described. Some of that's been in HR, some of it's been in diversity, some of it's been in running a global foundation, about $130 million philanthropic effort for the company. So when I think about the topic on the workforce and what happens, and I want to talk a little bit because I think it would be helpful for you, how does a company think about cities and locations and workers? In addition to the company, I'll speak from a personal standpoint. In the course of a 30-year career, I relocated 9 times. So I've actually lived in a number of your cities out there. And so we as sort of corporate geographically mobile people almost develop an internal screen and mechanism, to your point about the job as well as the location, and how it works not only for me as a leader or a worker, but how does it work for my family? How does it work for my extended family? How does it work for my well-being, et cetera? A couple of the things we think about, and I would say I think businesses think about this as well as philanthropic efforts have the same kind of screen. Think about the workforce. What is your workforce like now? So do you have the kinds of workers a company would want to have, or do you have the ability to produce them? So think about your colleges, your universities, and in particular your community colleges. If we don't have the skill set, do they produce that skill set? If they don't produce the skill set, are you willing to partner with a potential company to develop a curriculum to produce that skill set? That's going to be very important. Your Chamber of Commerce or your business council, how receptive are they to partnering with organizations and with your city government entity? We talked about the skills. What about the model? As we come in with a model for leadership, can that model be successful in your city, and can it be replicated? How easy is it? I'm going to get a little touchy now. It's Friday afternoon. How easy is it to work with you? I'm going to say that again. How easy is it to work with you? Because I've been at, I can't tell you how many, we just launched a program, the ribbon cutting. We've had the media's there, the press. We have the press release, the talking points. It's all great. But 3 days later, when my team, 2 levels down, has got to work with your team, 2 levels down, how easy is that? Or how hard is it? Does that make sense? Are we able to really create the partnership at all levels to achieve what we'd like to do? Those are the things we really think about. And then I would say, is your environment such that you are fostering empowerment amongst the people, the company, or the philanthropy we'll be working with? Are you open to new ideas? Are you open to doing it really differently and learning from anybody? even if it's outside the U.S., learning from anybody. Because I don't think any of our cities or any of our companies have a monopoly on good ideas and how it may be done differently. And given the digitalization of the workforce, as we've discussed, we've got to be willing to do that if we plan to win.
So Deb, you just walked through a series of criteria you look for as a company, both as an employer and an investor or a foundation partner in cities. So give us an example of a partnership that worked, that where together you found a city where they were easy to work with, they were open to ideas, and it resulted in some really good workforce initiatives.
Well, I would say I see Mayor Reed here in the back, and I think right before I retired last year, we were launching an initiative with the city of Atlanta, my colleague, former colleague Russell Stokes with GE Energy, around some of the challenges relative to crime, relative to lack of education, particularly in the minority communities. Mayor Reed, if I might use you as an example, was very willing to come and meet with leaders in GE, as well as diverse leaders in GE in particular, to understand what he was trying to do, to know that as an organization, the employees and the leaders wanted to participate, wanted to be engaged in the community, but wanted to follow the lead of a mayor who leads the citizenry in a way that we thought we could partner. Companies can't just go in and say, hey, we're here we are, we want to do stuff. It doesn't work that way. You've got to really understand and feel like, one of the things I've done throughout my career, I was heavily involved in acquisitions at one point. And, people think about you go in and buy something. So the question is, would somebody want to go in and buy your city and your leadership? Think about that. When you assess whether or not you can partner. And I think in Mayor Reed's case, I haven't been close to the program in months and months, but when I left, it was certainly off to a great start. But again, willingness to engage, willingness to have the team engage, willingness to be involved, willingness to look at measures, willingness to understand, is it working well, and be very hands-on.
That's great. That's great. I'm going to turn the floor back to Mayor so we can have a discussion.
Oh, absolutely. No, you were doing a great job moderating. No problems. Questions for our panelists? Okay. Mayor Mihalik.
Thank you very much. So, workforce
And
and...
introduce yourself, too, if you don't mind.
Sorry,
With your
Lydia
city.
Mihalik, Findlay, Ohio. A great panel.
We can't hear you, Lydia.
Okay.
Yeah,
It's on.
Get it closer.
Yeah?
Just pull it closer to you.
Okay, let's try this again. Lydia Mihalik, Findlay, Ohio. So great panel. I think workforce and having the access to available workforce is what the future of our cities will depend upon, and so will the businesses that call our cities home. One of the things that I find very frustrating is not just being able to get access to the folks who need to be retrained, who are able-bodied and capable of working. It's actually finding folks to come to your community to fulfill the available jobs that are there. Mayor, are you doing anything in particular for recruitment of people? We're actually looking through our state website for people who post resumes that are looking for a job, and I send them a personal letter that says, hey, we've got 1,500 jobs in the city of Findlay. We'd love you to come here and work and live in our community. Are you doing anything similar to that, or do you know of other cities that are sharing some of those stories?
I haven't heard of anything that direct, so it'll be very interesting to hear how that works when you get some data on that and kind of share that with us. Our experience has been that really the indirect value of quality of place has done the most good for us. And so for us, it's having a good story to tell about the community such that the project of being part of the community itself becomes motivating. We, for example, had, and there are ways to do this, by the way, that create a culture around civic innovation that spills out into other disciplines. So, for example, we have a program called In Focus. And what we do is we take graduates of a master's program at Notre Dame that fuses STEM and business. and they spend 1 year for not a whole lot of money working on some interesting, basically as consultants, working on an interesting civic issue. And they deliver real value. One of them saved us about $1 million by helping optimize the way our fire department works. So they work with the city or the county or the schools or the library. And at the end of that 1 year, a majority of them stay in the community. So it's actually one of the most effective brain gain programs we've ever attempted. Now, the number of specific people in that program is very modest. It's fewer than 10 fellows a year. But what we found is there's kind of a social culture around them that has helped us attract and retain others who then wind up playing roles everywhere from kind of the coffee shops to the modest but very real tech startup community that we have that gets you to that critical mass so that you can find the people that you need. I think in a way we've come full circle. You know, economic development used to be all about real estate, right? It's just buying or tearing down or putting up buildings. And then we started to expand that to realize that the way we really need to move is people, because people are the currency of the economy now. To me, in a way, we've come full circle by realizing the best way to get the people is to have really great places that people want to go to. And that's everything from the fundamentals like public safety to things like public art and great recreational, social, and commercial opportunities.
Can I just offer one sort of slightly contrarian view, which is that I absolutely agree that placemaking matters, particularly for stickiness, but economic development is also evolving so that folks aren't focusing on attraction anymore or simply about attraction. In fact, I think workers moving to new cities are actually declining. People are actually not moving today. So a lot of economic development and workforce folks are now really hyper-focused on how do you train your own. Right? Why are we always looking outside for talent? What do we need to do? How do we double down on making sure that we have the capacity to expand and improve the existing pipeline of talent in our communities? Because a lot of our communities, people grow up and they stay in town, right? So the best thing we can do for equity and opportunity is to continue to invest in the workers in our communities. If you have really strong places, that would also have the benefit of attraction. But the real power right now is how do we, again, prepare our existing workers?
So interesting hearing the data. I mean, to hear that people aren't moving. When we see
Mobility's down.
we'll see different trends. Maybe it's slower, but we still see different trends in South Carolina. And then obviously there was a reference earlier to the deployment of automation and how it's going to take longer. I mean, than we might expect. I know Mayor Reed and I were in a discussion just last weekend, and we were talking about autonomous vehicles, for example, and someone who represented some significant players in the tech industry indicated to us to start expecting broad deployment probably in the next, it was 24 months, I heard, right? 24 months, Kasim? I mean, so it's just interesting. I mean, coming from a state that enjoys a significant amount of foreign direct investment, more European foreign direct investment per capita than any state in the country, heavy emphasis on advanced manufacturing, automobiles and aerospace and the like. Just curious as to what this means for the future of our workforce. How do we engage those 11 million or so folks sitting on the couch? How many of those 11 million are affected by some of the other discussions we had earlier, challenges with opiates and the like? It's all just downright fascinating, to say the least. And I'm not sure how much that requires a response, but I will tell you also, seeing that chart of different professions, which many of which would be outside of the scope of, that you normally would think are impacted by globalization, certainly by technology. It starts having worry. It causes me, as a person with some law enforcement background as well, to wonder. So what starts happening when artificial intelligence begins to replace critical thinking? And I mean, we are, whether it's in 24 months or in 2055, we're going to be coming into a very brave new world. So just some observations. Any other questions? I apologize. Mayor Clarksville, and then our second Vice President, Mayor Burnett. Introduce yourself, Kim.
Kim McMillan, Clarksville, Tennessee, and it's just an interesting discussion, and thank you so much for all of your comments and insights. And I just want to kind of throw something else out there. Like many of the cities that I'm sure are represented here, we have a military installation in our town, Fort Campbell, which you may have heard of, the 101st Screaming Eagles, but it is a very large military installation, about 40,000 active duty that are there, and because of the things that the Army is doing, they are significantly downsizing in the sense of out-processing at one point about 600 soldiers a month. Well, obviously, our job in Clarksville is we'd like to keep them all there and their family. We'd like them to stay there and not go back to where they came from. So we have to work hard to make sure that we're providing these massive number of individuals the ability to become part of the workforce in our community. So we worked with Fort Campbell and the U.S. Army to develop programs. They call it Soldier for Life, which means you're always going to be involved, even if you maybe are not in the Army. You're going to still be involved with it. So they're working with us to develop programs where we can offer the kind of training that they need. I mean, obviously, if you spent a long time in the Army, you've got significant skills, but you may not have the exact skills that it takes to get a job in today's world in the workforce. But we find that people that come out of the Army obviously have a wonderful work ethic, whether they meant to or not, but it's been drilled into them, and they're ready to go to work, and they want to be retrained. And so if you can develop training programs to get them out in the workforce, and I think we've been pretty successful in working with the Army, and what we're trying to do now is figure out ways that we can translate this into the civilian workforce so that we can offer those kind of training programs and, acclimation programs to get people to want to come here, not just people who are already here and we don't want them to leave. So any suggestions about how we can do that would be greatly appreciated.
I just will offer an observation, having worked on the side of the receiver, so an entity that would want to receive retiring veterans. My observation is many of the people who come out of the military, because of how the military leadership is structured, are very broad. So you had a battalion, you had a unit, you had whatever. And I think the challenge is, as you talk about the programs you have, is to getting a skill set where you can not just be broad, but you can be deep. Because most companies, organizations who want to hire, I need somebody who's really deep. So I think the era of that broad project leader is over. I need that person who can go in and fix a truck inside out today, and so I think you see what I'm saying. That's my only observation is, as you're working with the organizations that are developing those transition programs, make sure they can get certified in something that is deep, and that you don't feel, or they don't feel devalued because now you're going deep versus broad, because the military values the breadth.
Exactly, but what we've done is to develop certification type programs where they can come out and they can, before they've evened out process, while they're in that process, can go through a program to get certified in different jobs that require a certification, so that the minute that the Army lets them go, they're ready to go to work tomorrow. And so that's some of the things that we've been doing to try to work on that. And we really want to translate that into the civilian workforce to be able to have those kind of internship programs, because I think that's important. You've got to recognize exactly what you said, and that is, as opposed to trying to go and get the broad degree so that you can say you have a college degree, you've got to focus now more narrowly on a specific thing that you're going to do, and what certifications or degrees do you have to do that one thing.
I just want to flag that rhymes with one of the most important economic development lessons that I think our region has learned, which is whatever your aspirations for the future, no matter how futuristic and cutting edge they are, they got to be rooted in what you've already got. And shortly before I took office, there was a lot of talk about nanotechnology is going to be $1 trillion industry, and because we had a nano research center open up, people thought all the jobs were going to be there, and they weren't. There's nothing wrong with nano, but we weren't just going to invent a cluster out of thin air. A lot of you were there recently when President Clinton spoke about this town in Indiana with like 2% unemployment because that's where they make all of the medical devices and orthopedic implants and stuff. It's not because they had this insight that one day orthopedic is going to be a big idea. It's actually because they made furniture. And all the skills that were useful in making furniture turned out to be useful in making the kind of early, primitive, artificial hips. And next thing you know, you've got the orthopedics capital of the world. So I think the same is true of workforce, and figuring out how to take what you've already got by way of this military and veteran skill set and shape that for something for the future is really smart.
Can I just,
You should be careful. Some veterans become mayors.
just one real quick piece of advice, because we're seeing this at the federal level, is for mayors to not create really narrow programs. So the failure of our federal trade adjustment program was we gave trade assistance to dislocated workers, and they had to prove it was because of a job lost through trade. What we need today is a set of retraining programs that help workers change industries no matter what the disruption is, whether it's military, right, downsizing, whether it's because Sprint is going to leave Kansas City. I'm just joking. Or if, I didn't have Mayor Slide James, where is he? Okay. But there are industry changes all the time in our communities. And the question is, do we have a flexible system that captures and catches workers when we can anticipate industries wholly changing and help them translate their existing capabilities into other applications?
Mayor Barnett.
Yes, thank you, Mayor Benjamin. Just, I think a lot of the points just made in the last couple of minutes are spot on. Mayor Buttigieg, thinking about what your community is. In my region, Metro Detroit, it was, the understanding that this onslaught of manufacturing jobs that we lost in the recession probably aren't going to come back as traditional manufacturing jobs, and preparing a community that's used to building things and talking about how you turn that into those skill sets into what the autonomous vehicle environment will look like, and the similar skill sets. We've seen that some strong successes with that, and appreciate the leadership of others that have sort of paved the way for us to copy some programs. I guess one of the things that I would ask specifically, if there was one thing in your mind, whether it be one city, one state, one university program, one place that's doing it better than anyone else, or one place that we might send our staffs to understand a great best practice, is there some place that pops to the top of your mind?
And don't say Rochester Hills, Michigan.
I mean, second, after that one.
So in the report that we did on sort of the continuum of interventions for workers, whether you're dislocated as a young person, whether you're a middle-aged worker, whether you're near retirement, and your different skill sets, that there's different best practice programs for each one of those interventions, and they're in the report. So Washington's iBest has a really great program for people who are trying to transition from community college into occupational training and then into jobs. Those are great bridge programs. There are great emerging apprenticeship programs where dual learning is really important for people who are really interested in on-the-job training, to helping. What I saw in a lot of the data for the out of work are, and Mayor Fisher and I were just talking about this during the break, there are a lot of folks that have some college degree, 1 year in school and then dropped out, or a BA, and they can't translate that into a job opportunity. And so there are positions, there's a New York program, and there are others we've identified that try to identify and capture people with some college degree and help them get that completion or into a more industry-relevant credential. And so interestingly enough, we are in the process of trying to figure out how to marry initiatives between economic development officials who are focused on workforce training and credential attainment as a mutually reinforcing goal in a bunch of cities. So I would say, take a look at the report. There are cities that have really good individual programs, but no one city does the entire continuum. So that we catch people no matter where they are in their career life cycle. And so I think there's a real opportunity for invention and partnerships in this space.
Last two words to Mayor Adler of Austin, the Mayor of Santa Barbara, Helene Snyder, and did you have your hand up too, Bill? I'll let Mayor Soglin have the very last word. So in that order, Adler, Snyder, and Soglin. And let's keep it tight, y'all. We got to get into this last session, please.
I was going to add on that all the cities are different, and we're all facing this challenge in lots of different ways. But the last several comments that have come are the ones that have resonated the most with our experience in Austin. We're a real fast-growing city, and we're lucky in that we're creating a lot of jobs. The problem that we have in Austin is that the people who live in Austin are not trained to take the jobs that are being created. So at any given point, I have 40,000 jobs that are open and 40,000 people that live in my city that would be great candidates for those jobs, but they don't have the training to be able to take them. And the world is dynamic enough that when that job becomes available, if they can't fill it with somebody that's in my city, they'll immediately fill it with somebody who's not in my city, which is why there's one of the reasons why there are so many people that are coming in. So we have the same issue. For us, it's all about training. It's all about taking a population that exists and giving them the middle skill jobs to be able to, middle skill skills to be able to take those jobs. And what we're learning is that the normal training programs that we used to do in our city don't work, because by the time someone goes through the training program, as studied as we are in trying to create a training program so that they'll be able to take the job when they come out, we're training for the job that existed when the training started, and we have too high a number of people that go through that program, and then that job isn't available for them. So we started doing two things. We started working with the community college in the city, but all about creating opportunities for the person to be in college and in the job at the same time. And then we're taking all the economic development incentives that we used to give to businesses to attract businesses, and we're giving them to businesses to train on site for the job. So we'll go to somebody and say, yeah, you really want to hire someone that has 3 years experience. Here's somebody that doesn't have experience, but we'll pay them for you for a period of time until they get the experience you want, and then they will have been trained by you for exactly what it is that you want them to do. And we're moving more and more to that kind of internship and apprenticeship models in everything that we do. We just passed a really large transportation bond election, and we're requiring of all the contractors that participate in that program certain levels of apprenticeship programs associated with the skilled labor on contract positions, on welding, and on those kinds of things. We're finding that if we don't train in place, we lose that opportunity, and the only way to train in place is with employers working with you, and the only way to get that done is by figuring out how to incent that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Mayor Snyder, Mayor Soglin.
Thank you. Helene Schneider, Mayor, City of Santa Barbara, California, and I appreciate the discussion. Another angle, actually, of looking at this with cities I'd love the panel to comment on, which is, as this technology changes, it obviously impacts how cities work as a city. Its permitting process, the building and safety sectors, from autonomous vehicles and how you deal with transportation and circulation issues to the sharing economy. I find a lot of times government and policies tend to lag behind the innovation that's in the cities, which then stunts the economic growth. Any tips or ideas that you've seen in other cities in trying to ride that wave and not get overcome by it?
I don't have a magic bullet there, other than you recognize it first and then run like heck. The same sorts of pressures that you see in private sector, I think, to move along a digital journey, move along a data journey to understand how to use data better. All of those things are true in municipal government. In some ways, it's just harder. I mean, in my more cynical moments, I say, you know, the three parts of the economy which have basically not had as much benefit from these digital technologies as the rest of the economy are public sector healthcare and education. And you know, it is hard work to do. It is absolutely essential to do, both in terms of your own city operations as well as the economic development you can spur by using those technologies better.
One suggestion might be to think about what I'll call sort of a stir program between your industry, which may be more innovative than you describe, and your city government. So short-term sort of internship, if you will. So are there people from some of industry who may come and work with your teams for a period of time? Maybe it's 3 months, maybe it's 6 months. Companies are often very open to that and will help fund that for a period of time. So it may be a way of, again, sharing information and being willing to open and learning from anywhere. But again, that may be because then you learn both sides, right? So the company will learn how the government works locally and how we may partner better with the government. The government may get some innovations from the industry that's in your city.
The one thing I would advise is to do an exercise where you name some of the assumptions beneath your processes and then check which ones of them may be subject to change. So for example, your planning process includes an assumption that a certain number of surface parking spaces are required for a new development. Think about whether that assumption is likely to hold.
Could a couple of things here, and this kind of builds on something Michael said. You know, we're still at the very forefront of technology's impact on all industries, including government. And I think in that way, we still have not realized all the productivity potential out of technology. It needs to become even more democratized. It needs to spread from certain industries to more industries. It has to move from large firms down to SMEs adapting new technologies. It needs to move from the coast and more into the heartland. So I think there's a huge opportunity. And when I think about government, is one of the things, I know Bloomberg and their government innovation team may not be here still, but I still think that we have enormous opportunity for government to invest in the capacity of their own staff and their own IT systems to take advantage of the big data that's coming, so you can do better planning around your infrastructure, around mobility, around public service delivery. I know there's a lot of public sector innovation in this space, but I still think we're at the very early stages of really building that capacity out so that government is a beneficiary of all the new technologies and information coming out so that it supports, again, public good. Last thing I'll say is I really want us to focus on systems, and I know we've talked a lot about education, credentials, workforce training, maybe collaborations between economic development and workforce, but I also want to mention the other thing, which is maybe prompted by something that the mayor from Austin mentioned, which is we need to see more collaboration between economic development and community development. That there's a lot of these new companies, whether it's an Amazon warehouse or others coming into the market, but they're located in places that are too far away from target underserved populations. And so there might be a skills gap issue, but there's also a geography issue. And what I hear is we expect low-income people to travel an hour to where these jobs are and complain that the jobs exist, but we're not taking advantage of them. So what I see in more cities now is real explicit coordination that needs to be done, that if you're going to attract and cite new business activity and new job creation, are we working with the nonprofits in some of these underserved markets to put together marketing information, the right data, to really get those companies to cite closer in, right? And so I think there's just huge opportunities that cities can do to create more accessible opportunities in this changing period.
The final brief word, Mayor Soglin.
Thank you, Matt. Madison, Wisconsin. I'm curious, going back to, I think, one of the very first slides, which was the Atlanta situation, and I want to tie it to what we've been talking about now, which is the mismatch of jobs available and job skills. I can understand what happens when you have one major employer, a Studebaker, an Oscar Mayer, who closes a plant, shuts the doors, and there's abruptly 500, 1,000, several thousand people unemployed. But what about the situation where in Atlanta, it wasn't just one employer? What leads to those conditions where you suddenly have skilled people unemployed? How do you anticipate it? And what do you do before you arrive at those kinds of numbers?
All right.
So-
I'm going to ask you for a brief answer as well. We've got to move on. Okay?
Yeah, so what I would just say, this is really the hardest thing about being proactive about change, is one of the things that we want to reinforce is this disruption is affecting all industries. And one of the things that I would, but there are some industries and occupations are more vulnerable than others. And so I think what you're going to see from data from Brookings very shortly in the fall, we've got an automation piece coming out, we've got this digital skills coming out. It's going to show you which occupations, which industries are going to go through the most tumult over the next 5 years in your community based on the industry mix that you have. And that might give you some signs for, beginning to offer, or promote alternative choices for workers, partnering with those employers, working with nonprofits in advance to make sure you have programs in place when that disruption happens.
All right. That was good. That was good and tight. I'm fine. Thank you. How about a round of applause for our panelists? Amy, thank you so much. Great job moderating. All right, y'all, we are officially in the home stretch, y'all. You guys are soldiers. Obviously, we all know, and Mayor Landrieu tells us every time we're together, the #1 job for mayors is making sure we have safe communities. Public safety is always a critical concern, but oftentimes we think about it in a very isolated way. Violence in our communities affects far more than physical safety, and it's caused by a complex range of factors. In order to truly protect our communities, our approach to criminal justice needs reform. Today we have an impressive lineup of panelists who will be speaking to the intersection of violence and public health. David Kennedy and Dr. Gary Slutkin will highlight 2 proven but different approaches to reducing violence: the National Network for Safe Communities and Cure Violence. Mitch has implemented both of them here in New Orleans, and of course have the Chief of Police, Superintendent Michael Harrison, who's been stalwart in all the issues of public safety that we've been dealing with nationally over the last several years. They're going to discuss how things are working here in New Orleans. This session has been organized to allow plenty of time following their presentations for discussion with all of our colleagues, so we can ask questions about these approaches, how they might be able to be implemented in your respective cities, and other issues relating to violence that are of concern to you. Our moderator for the session is Michelle Spencer. She's the Associate Director of the Bloomberg American Health Initiative at Johns Hopkins University. Through this initiative, the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health is establishing a network of public health practitioners, organizations, and researchers to gain insight and make progress in 5 priority areas, including violence. Ms. Spencer previously directed the Health Enterprise Zone Initiative and Prevention and Health Promotion Administration at the Maryland Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. She also served as Chief of Staff at the Baltimore City Health Department from 2005 to 2012, at which, among many other things, she managed special projects, including the city's anti-violence initiatives. Michelle, it's all yours.
Well, thank you.
You got to turn it on. Press that little button right there.
Perfect.
There you go.
Perfect. Thank you, Mayor, and good afternoon to all of you. It's a real privilege to be here and certainly to be able to greet this panel and to be able to moderate such an important session. Certainly, violence is a public health issue, and we address it and approach it in that way. And it's a real honor to be able to think about and be able to present 2 models to you that are very different, but 2 models that are occurring all across the country. And so I know that at the start of today's meeting, we were told that we are not only a think tank, we are a do tank. And I'm sure if you were here for the 8 a.m. session, you recall that being said. We were reminded throughout the day of the importance of partnerships, the role of healthcare, the importance of equity and to be intentional and inclusive of that. We had discussions about economic and community development, and we were encouraged, certainly with our first panel, to be innovative in our thinking and implementation of new approaches to critical public health issues. And we discussed that particularly this morning when we talked about the opioid crisis. And I'm sure that you're aware that later on this evening or late this afternoon, it was declared as a epidemic across the country. And so just from being here and the discussions that you all led and being informed really, I think, helped to shape that. I will say to you that back in 2016, Mayor Bloomberg gave a special gift to the School of Public Health to address 5 critical issues that are not necessarily seen as public health issues. And one of those 5 issues, as was noted a moment ago, is violence, because we do address this from a public health perspective. We have leading experts, and I know that this is the last panel of the day, and it's so impressive that you all remained to really engage us in this dialogue. So I have leading experts in the field, Dr. Gary Slutkin and Professor David Kennedy, along with Superintendent Harrison of the New Orleans Police Department. My goal this afternoon is for us to have a robust discussion that will leave you with a charge for action, a charge that requires your ongoing commitment and engagement, a charge that requires you to consider interagency, interdisciplinary, environmental, and social justice components in your own responses and approaches to reducing violence in your cities and in communities across the country. It is to present 2 models this afternoon that have been implemented in various cities. Unfortunately, violence has become a fabric of our everyday lives, with over 16,000 homicides annually and a loss of billions of dollars in productivity, fractured and increasingly stressed and trauma-exposed communities. It is critical that we identify and implement models that works for each of our communities, models that are affirming of our community and our commitment to reducing violence, increasing transparency and trust, models that uphold the civil liberties of citizens all across our country. An associated goal of today's discussion is also to inform our understanding of the impact of childhood experiences, the risks and protective factors that exist at various intervention levels, the leadership between community and law enforcement, and the role it plays in addressing violence. We are challenged to see every opportunity as our obligation to act and to use resources that are available to address this growing public health threat. We are challenged to identify risk factors associated with violence, to have a collaborative approach that includes all forms of community and all areas of agencies that report directly to you: law enforcement, social service agencies, fire departments, and hospitals. All are necessary partners. We must acknowledge the social factors as well at the neighborhood levels, factors that include housing, transportation, neighborhood stability, and the sustainability of interagency approaches is critical. So given this, as it was noted just a moment ago, I've overseen prevention programs across the state of Maryland, and I used to say to my staff that it's important that you just not only present information, but that you give a charge so that you're able to follow up on what it is that your expectations are, that you provide information, but that you also be intentional and impactful. And so I will say to you with the utmost respect that your authority extends beyond the boundaries of any one agency, and the models presented today requires an interagency approach that strengthens the bond and trust between communities and law enforcement. The models require silo busting at the individual agency level for transparency and innovation to occur. The models requires the lens of public health that includes a social justice frame. The models require hard work and a recognition and appreciation that the work is indeed worthy. And it takes the collective working together to achieve sustained progress. And it also takes those non-traditional individuals that you may not necessarily see as partners in this fight against violence prevention in your communities. And we will hear a little bit about that from our superintendent. So I'm going to pause for just a moment, but I will say that it's about also creating policies to support communities, policies that are meaningful criminal justice reform that recognizes the impact on public safety and communities. I'm going to introduce first Professor David Kennedy. Professor Kennedy is the director of the National Network for Safe Communities, a project of John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York City. Professor Kennedy and the National Network support cities implementing strategic interventions to reduce violence, minimize arrest and incarceration, and strengthen relationships between law enforcement and communities. These interventions have been proven effective in a variety of settings by a Campbell collaboration evaluation and are currently being implemented in Chicago, New Orleans, Baltimore, Oakland, and many other cities nationwide. Followed by Professor Kennedy, we will hear from Dr. Gary Slutkin. Dr. Slutkin is a professor of epidemiology and international health at the University of Illinois Chicago School of Public Health. Dr. Slutkin is a physician, epidemiologist, infectious disease control specialist, and founder and executive director of Cure Violence. He's recognized as an innovator in violence prevention. Dr. Slutkin sees the issues of violence as a fundamental misdiagnosed and has presented his solution-oriented understanding to the World Bank, the State Department, the World Health Organization, the Institute of Medicine, MIT, Harvard Law School, and the National Intelligence Council. Dr. Slutkin applied lessons learned for more than a decade fighting epidemics in Africa and Asia to the creation of a public health model to reduce violence through behavior change and disease control methods. The public health method is being currently replicated in more than 50 cities, 50 sites in the U.S. and cities, as well as 7 countries abroad. Finally, we'll hear from Superintendent Harrison, who joined the New Orleans Police Department in 1991. He advanced through the ranks of the department, becoming a detective in the major case narcotics section in 1995. He was promoted to sergeant in 1998 and served in the 8th Police Department and then in the Public Integrity Bureau until 2006. Superintendent Harrison has an extensive and impressive list of accomplishments, including crime reduction in 2012 and 13 under his leadership. Prior to joining the New Orleans Police Department, Superintendent Harrison served 8 years with the Louisiana Air National Guard. Each of our panelists will have 10 minutes to present their models, and then we'll open up to all of you for questions and dialogue. Professor Kennedy.
What she said. I'm a communities guy, and what you've just heard is there isn't anything that we all think is important in communities. Fundamental well-being, economic development, good education, good government, none of it works if people are afraid to go outside. So we all know that there are neighborhoods usually in most of our cities where people do not feel good about being outside and they worry when they send their kids out. That is our fundamental obligation to address those conditions. I mean, don't get that right, you don't get anything right. So thanks, Michelle. Very nice to be here. I've got a bunch of friends in the room. Some of them I've seen, some of them I hope I catch up with. Talking about violence prevention is a different conversation today than it was not all that long ago, because it is now empirically, scientifically the case that there are things that work around violence prevention. And you've got a couple of representatives of the best examples of that with you today. That wasn't true not that long ago. So I've been doing this for 30 years, and until about 15 years ago, people did lots of things about violence or in the name of preventing violence, and none of them were consistently effective. Most of them were not effective at all, despite the resources and the ideological commitment that they commanded. That's not true any longer. And there is a set of fundamental understandings now and empirical realities around the violence and the violence dynamics that have driven that. You are running cities, and at the level of ordinary common sense policy, what effective violence prevention means is something that makes a meaningful felt difference in the lives of the communities that are suffering with this unconscionable set of problems, that can be done at scale, that produce results at scale. So you can find all kinds of little boutique programs and studies and such that found statistical significance with this cohort of high school students. That's not meaningful in the world. You want things that will actually make a difference in your neighborhoods, and that ordinary people can show up and produce, and that can be real. That's available to us now. The fundamental facts on the ground that have driven this work is that there is, in every place where this kind of violence presents itself, there is a very small number of very hot places. Not bad neighborhoods, not hot spots, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but if you map your city for homicide and gun violence, it will turn out that 5 or 6 or 7% of the blocks and street corners are persistently very active, and the rest of the city fundamentally will not be. Those places are persistent. They don't change from year to year. Your city is not dangerous. You've got these places that are, and in a very similar way, it's hot people. You will be able to find groups and networks of very active people. They are in practice in gangs and drug crews and that sort of very active street life. And if you identify all of those groups and networks, they will of course be concentrated in your hot neighborhoods, and they will collectively represent typically under 0.5% of your city's population. Under 0.5%. And they will be connected with 60, 70, 75% of all of your homicide. So let me not talk about violence prevention for a second. I am really pleased to be here with the mayors, because mayors and others like you need to understand what I'm about to say. We should take those facts as celebrations of the resilience of your neighborhoods and your communities. So the violence is always concentrated in historically distressed minority neighborhoods. We're blunt about this. We should all be blunt about it. White folks don't live like this. This is entirely a minority community issue. Not all minority communities, but where it's an issue, it is in those neighborhoods. We have all spent our lives listening to and talking about these neighborhoods as dangerous neighborhoods, hot spots, depending on your orientation, bad places full of bad people, places where there is no respect for human life, places where there are manifold root cause issues, bad schools, historical oppression, racism, lack of economic opportunity, bad transportation, lack of health care, astronomical dropout rates, single-parent families, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Plus, indubitably, a history of racism and that kind of malign oppression. Every single one of at least those things is right. The communities have absolutely been subjected to and remain subjected to those sorts of issues. And at the same time, we now know as empirical fact that in those most dangerous communities, it is going to be at the worst day possible, under 2% of the community that are in any way at this elevated high risk. The community, we should say, despite what we have done to it and not done for it, is so fundamentally in and of itself healthy and resilient that it has resisted all of these pressures and raised its young so that almost nobody is acting like this. And that's exactly not what we say about them. We malign them because of the actions of a few. We impugn everybody. We say things like, if we don't get to the kids by the time they're 8, it's too late, they're lost, when in fact that's just not true. So we should take the science about violence as recognizing that we actually have some science about nonviolence, and that nonviolence overwhelmingly dominates. And if we were better at speaking about communities that we have oppressed and neglected in that way, we would all be a lot better off. All right. End of that particular rant. So we have, where there is violence, this very small superheated network. We should think of them first as people at high risk, because they are. National homicide rate is now edging back up a little bit. It's about 5 per 100,000. If you are in these high-risk networks, your homicide risk will easily be well over 500 per 100,000 every year. The people who've done this work have done the math. You would be safer on the ground as serving military in Afghanistan than walking around doing what you are doing in your own neighborhood. Everything that has worked the best for addressing violence has engaged with those high-risk people. And people love to look at Gary and me and say they're different models, they're in opposition. They've got way more in common than they don't. And the thing that they have most in common is that they both engage in a really granular way with these high-risk folks and the dynamics between and within those high-risk folks, right? Yes. Right. The stuff that I've been part of puts together law enforcement. This is how I know Superintendent Harrison, not just the police, but prosecutors and corrections and all those sorts of folks. It puts together service providers and those who can provide support, and it puts together what we call moral voices in the community, people that these high-risk guys respect and will listen to. We say about them they don't care about anybody. That's not true. They just don't care about us. Every gang member loves his mother and his grandmother. That's the way it works. And there are people in every neighborhood who have standing with these guys. We should take this seriously. Let me ask you a question. Raise your hand, please, at the table if you grew up afraid of the police. Thanks. Raise your hand at the table if you grew up afraid of your mother. Right. That's the way the world really works. Informal social control is way more powerful than formal social control. And this stuff is all written up. We've got handouts for you. I won't go through all the mechanics of it. It turns out to be possible to put those partnerships of law enforcement and service folks and community people together, work directly with these high-risk folks, and say to them consistently, everybody here wants you alive, everybody here wants you not to go to jail and to go to prison. Your community needs you to understand how much it absolutely rejects the violence, and people who love you and who you love need you to stop this. You're doing unbelievable damage. We will help you change your life if you want it, and we're going to tell you ahead of time what the legal response to violence is going to be, because it's going to be there, and we want you to understand how hot the stove is because we don't want you to touch it. You do that right, and you can have substantial impact across the places in your city where you've got these problems. One more minute. So Michelle talked a lot about social justice. These communities have experienced intergenerational bad treatment at the hands of law enforcement. Focusing in this way on the few and treating them with respect and support, making it clear to the rest of the community that you're not doing zero tolerance there anymore because they're not the problem. lets you get on the right side of this legitimacy crisis that we're having in the communities. And the research supports this. One of the most recent studies on this out of Cincinnati showed that they were able to bring their violent crime down 40% and their citywide arrest rate down 40% at the same time. So that's my minute. Thank you.
Push. Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? Is it late in the day or are we great? All right. So I've got, there's two handouts that relate to this presentation. This is a one-pager, which is an overview of our work and where we work. And this is a slide presentation that I'm going to skim. And just by way of introduction, so I'm, as Michelle said, I'm a physician, I'm an epidemiologist. I've come at this problem differently because my background is different. And my background is that I worked at World Health Organization on other epidemics. I worked on cholera and tuberculosis and AIDS, mostly in Africa. And so I kind of saw the world through this kind of set of experiences. When I came back to this country and I looked at violence, I was, to my own surprise, seeing this as if it was exactly like an infectious disease. Why? Because these things called hotspots to us in epidemiology are epicenters, and the curves were standard epidemic curves. And more importantly than that, the greatest risk factor of a violent event was a preceding violent event, which is the same thing as flu. The greatest predictor of flu or a cold or TB is having been exposed to it. And in fact, it's dose responsive, just like all infectious diseases. And without the exposure or the recruitment or the following, it does not occur. And the rates are much higher dependent on the amount of exposure. So we took advantage of this in the year 2000 and tried out treating this exactly the way we treat other infectious diseases with what we call health workers recruited from the same population, that is to say people who had come from the same street with the same relationships and so on. And we ended up calling them outreach workers and interrupters and behavior change agents and eventually hospital responders. And we got a 67% drop in shootings and killings in the first year. And the funders said this was in the worst police district in the country at that time. And the funder said, do it again, and we got 45% drop in 4 more communities. And since then, we've expanded this, and it's been replicated in multiple cities and even in countries in Latin America and in the Middle East now. So what is it that is about the way that we're looking at this? And that I want to take us to this, paper slide presentation, is that this requires this fundamental idea, and it kind of relates to what Mayor Whaley said before about we have to look at, when we were talking about opioids, your quote was, have to think about this very differently than we used to think about it. And that is to say that the person who is doing violence, think about the way you ordinarily think of that person, actually has a health problem, has a contagious health problem, has acquired through cortical brain copying mechanisms and through recruitment mechanisms that are mediated by processes that we now know, dopamine mechanisms and pain mechanisms that modulate following and social approval and the avoidance of social disapproval. These kinds of things cause people to predictably do violence, that is to say, as their friends are doing it, and this is what they care about. And so we use this to the advantage and began to program around this. But to just rewind a little bit, there are now dozens of studies that, and it's summarized in this Institute of Medicine report, which is downloadable on our website, that show that violence is in fact contagious. It actually meets the definition of disease and it meets the definition of contagious. And the definition of contagious only is that it causes more of itself. And in this particular case, it's the brain that's doing the processing to replicate itself unconsciously because it's so darn salient, and almost all of our behaviors are in fact copied and following various norms. I will say, for example, I am dressed like this, which is very much copying behavior, and it's the norm of this room, and I'm also noticing that nobody's smoking. And it is not a law enforcement issue that no one is smoking here. It is and a third of us were smoking when I was in medical school watching angiograms. But the norms have changed. And likewise, we have experiences of someone pulling out a gun at a bar and everyone saying, wait a second, what are you doing? Don't you realize we don't do that anymore? This is public health. Changing behaviors, changing norms. This is public health. But as David mentioned, it's working with the high-risk people that is the essential ingredient here, because the epidemic process is being managed, is being perpetuated, not with the little kids and not with the high school kids, but with the guys who are doing it now. And it's the younger kids who are just watching them unconsciously wanting to be like them. Do you follow me? And so if you just follow this into this second page here to the top, if you can be with me, at the top left, this requires a different way of thinking to X out this idea of bad people, to X out this idea of bad choices, and to even forget about, as David mentioned, the idea of adverse circumstances being the primary issue here, but that this is actually contagion within adverse circumstances, which is also true of most other contagious problems. And what you'll see here is a picture of the following behavior of a young child and the following in copying behavior. This is no coincidence of the tattooing and so on. And then if you go to the next page, what you see is the result of all of this following within social networks is epidemic curves, not shown here. But the outbreaks, new outbreaks like we're seeing now in some cities, and all epidemics are just manifestations of collections of mini outbreaks happening all over the place. So another piece of good news here is that we know how to stop epidemics. And the way to stop epidemics is to prevent an event from happening, and then if there is an event, to prevent the second event from happening and subsequent events. And this is what's called preventing spread. So that's what these workers do. That's what these interrupters do. You've all heard of interrupters. There's a movie made about them. And they are people who exist in the neighborhood, who have been recruited very carefully and hired and trained and supervised and supported for the process of finding out what's going on, who's upset at who slept with somebody's girlfriend. Police don't care about who slept with somebody's girlfriend. The police don't care about who disrespected someone at the party. They have too many other things to do. But these workers, and plus it takes a lot of time to cool somebody down. Plus there's no crime that's been done yet. So this is where these guys fill in that space. And they're called violence interrupters. And then they're trained in how to cool people down, how to buy time. The guys call it babysitting or shadowing, and then staying with them until there are not retaliations. In one study in Chicago, retaliations were stopped 100% of the time in 5 communities and 50% of the time in 2 others. And then if there is an event, then to prevent retaliations. So this is the sequencing. This is the usual way of managing epidemics. The workers look like the neighborhood. Why? Because they already exist in the neighborhood. It's all done according to epidemiologic principles of mapping what groups or cliques are here, who are the guys that need to be reached, who can reach them. So this is very systematically done according to protocols. It's managed in the community. Ordinarily, if this is supervised by the health department. In New York City, there are 19 communities that are doing this. People are saying this has replaced stop and frisk. Instead of people being bothered, they're being interacted with. I'm talking about the very, very highest risk people. This is managed by the health department in New York City. It's being managed by the health department in Baltimore. Then these guys are deployed, and then after events have been cooled down, we stay with them for 6 to 24 months. To not only provide them with services, which of course are critical, and what David and his group are doing so beautifully, but also to work on their thinking over time, so that the next time they're insulted or someone sleeps with their girlfriend or whatever, their thinking is different. They have a new set of skills. They have a new set of responses. They have a new set of excuses. They have a new set of people to call up and say, you know, this just happened to me. What should I do? And in other words, staying in touch with our group and so on. So some of the results of this are shown here. I'm not going to go over them. You can look at this yourself. I want to point out that the fourth element of this now is the interaction with the hospitals. Just like in opioids, as was discussed this morning, how important it is to initiate treatment right there rather than just letting the person go. Here it's important to have someone continue to manage the person who is shot, should he live, by having someone continue to work with him because they have very high risk of what we call relapse. In other words, to be shot again or to shoot someone again. So we have to stay with them. This has to be administratively organized. But in addition, just like for TB, we not only have to keep the person on treatment, as it were, in this case it's behavior change and so on, but we have to look for the potential secondary cases. The immediate secondary cases are retaliations. Are you with me? Someone got shot, his friends are going to show what great friends they are by causing someone else to be shot, and the whole weekend is a mess. So instead, the hospital responders come within 2 hours, usually within 1, 24-hour phone on this, and then the community is interacted with to keep everybody else cool and the thing doesn't evolve into a new mini epidemic. So on the bottom of page 5 to the right, I wanted to show you also how rapid this is. Because usually when mayors have an outbreak or they have an increase, they call somebody, I know like League of Cities, so what should we do? What should we do? You know, what can we do that's fast? And usually the response is, well, more police or gang crackdowns. Public health interventions are fast. It isn't so fast to set it up, but it can be. We have now multiple times developed the experience of set up fast if the funds are there to pay the workers. But what I wanted to show you here is this Logan Square experience in Chicago on the bottom right on page 5, is when the intervention started, how rapidly the peak stopped, and then you see it drop a second time, and that's when it was doubled. That was when the intervention was doubled. And then interrupters were added later on. And you can also see how sustained this is. These are sustained reductions. There are relapses in this too, but people have to be trained into how to respond to them. You know, there's new groups of people, someone else is upset, someone got out of prison. There's reasons why things relapse. But this is, public health is rapid and sustained. I mean, the next shows the rapidity of the response on the top of page 6 in Baltimore when it started, the fast drop-ups of the peaks and the number of points of 0. And then on the top right on page 6 is the most recent outbreak in Chicago, where one group of our staff got some private money and just rapidly within 2 weeks dropped this off to where the rest of the city was. And you can see also the prison program, the rapidity of this. And I should also add that there are experiences that are occurring now in Baltimore and in New York City where it's been up to a year and sometimes up to 2 years of zero shootings or 0 killings. In the setting, sometimes when there's only like 5 or 6 that would have been expected, sometimes in the setting of when there's been 10 or 20 expected. So why does this work? The workers are trusted. It's an inside-out approach. By the way, all epidemics are managed from the inside out. Ebola, they tried a law enforcement approach. What worked was the health workers on the inside who were trusted, talking about explaining things. Same thing for cholera. It's an inside-out approach. The people who are talking to them, they trust. And we're able to work with and public health is always working with I mean, they're going to bars and brothels and alleys and shooting galleries, you know, while nobody's looking. No one knows what public health does. Why? Because we don't say, here's the TB patient, we caught him. It's all invisible. It's all invisible what's being done. So this is how we can help. It's with model replication and with the rapid reduction approach. And I want to say just, you know, how incredibly happy I am to be with David, who I've learned a lot from over the years, who's just continuing to improve it, and the work that was already so wonderful. And there's several cities where we're working, where it's not us exactly, it's our workers, are finding the points of interaction and the points of separation that make this even, a 1 + 1 is 10 type of operation. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope everybody's enjoying their time in our great city. New Orleans historically has been a city that has experienced high levels of violence. It continues to experience that, and we are using and continue to use the focused deterrence model, working with Professor Kennedy now for about 5 years. We're seeing a consistent decrease in the application of that focused deterrence model, where when we started, it was targeted at the small group of individuals, as has already been stated, that commit the majority amount of our violent crimes. It's a group of African-American young men in our city between the ages of 16 and 24. We have now seen a 5th-year decrease in the reduction of gun violence and shootings and murders in that target age group, to the point that the program works. The demographic has now changed because the average age of a victim now is 28. The average age of the perpetrator is outside of that age range. It's sometimes now above 24. We're seeing more and more perpetrators outside of the age range. So we're seeing a 5th-year decrease, consistent decrease in the target age range, which shows us that the model has been working for us, using a multi-pronged approach of, number one, prevention with social services, and that are all connected to all of our law enforcement partners, intervention with our street interrupters, as you've already heard. We're working with one part of the city, applying the interrupters that are working to, because they have street credibility, they can go to people and prevent some of the retaliations that we're seeing. So while we see retaliations, they're not always the grouping gang violence retaliations. They're sometimes the more independent violent act or bad actors committing violent acts that are committing these bad acts because of other independent crimes that we can point to. But it is with data and good intelligence that we identify this small group of people who have the highest risk factors, that we can target those individuals because we know they commit the majority amount of our violent gun crimes and shootings and homicides. By using that data, we have two entities, an investigative body of detectives and a proactive body of street gang officers. That's our enforcement piece. So when we get bad acts, or when we have bad acts, the data that's given to us through our interrupters and through other intelligence fields that feed us intelligence, we're immediately delivering custom notifications to them, which is a crucial part of this focused deterrence model. We're knocking on their door in broad daylight in front of all of their people to tell them, we know that you're involved, we know that you know who might be involved, and we're here to put you on notice that we're watching. I think a big part of the success is the ability to be able to deliver on the promise that when you say we are coming after this group or this gang or these group of individuals, whether they're loosely organized like they're here in New Orleans or they're very structured like they might be in Los Angeles and Chicago, really doesn't matter. But the ability and the capacity to deliver on that promise has been a big part of our success, so that in a few months we are able to put together these strong RICO cases through partnerships with the district attorney and the U.S. attorney. And then, unlike a lot of places, we have great partnerships with both of them at the table. So we're taking enforcement cases to both entities, the U.S. attorney and the district attorney, wherever we can get the biggest bang, the fastest for the buck, that's where we're going. But the relationships are the crucial part. It's the social service providers that are providing services to young men, that when we call them into court and explain to them that they have an option, either you're going to get out of this life of violence and we're going to give them that opportunity that day, or you're going to make us come after you and we're going to stop you. So we'll help you if you let us, but we'll stop you if you make us. And we deliver on that promise. So every young man that decides to take us up on the offer for help, whether it's housing, whether it's drug addiction, alcohol addiction, education to get a GED, job skills, jobs, residence, we can relocate them. We are able to offer them that very day, should they take us up on an offer. But should they not, we take strong action with partnerships with all of the federal agencies are in the room, the district attorney, U.S. attorney, the sheriff, DEA, FBI, ATF, marshals, the like, everybody's there to be able to show that the whole weight of the government is coming after you because you refuse to take our offer and you continue to commit violence against our citizens. So the social service providers partnering with law enforcement, with the enforcement, plus the prevention with the interrupters, all working together, all being organized, has been the key to our success. But it really requires buy-in from 3 levels, and you'll hear me talk about this later, buy-in from the city administration, buy-in from the police administration and leadership, buy-in from the rank and file of the police officers. Because it is a non-traditional, unorthodox way of reaching people, because the initial reaction to when we see a spike in violence is, as you said, Doctor, to add more police. Send a very strong show of force. But really, what has been working for us is to send interrupters in who have street credibility, who can talk some of these tempers down so that the police enforcement is not always necessarily right there. And so we've seen great success using that. We call it ceasefire. It's called Cure Violence in other places. It has worked very well. The social service providers offering young men an opportunity to get out of a life of crime has worked very well. And of course, strong enforcement delivering on a promise to go after them. So when we do a call-in and there are 30 or 40 or 50 young men in the courtroom mandated by a judge under subpoena for them to be there, and we tell them, we're going to help you if you let us, but we're going to stop you if you make us. When we make a promise to go after them, should they commit another murder right after that call-in, we deliver on that promise. And to that point, we've indicted 117 gang members from 13 different gangs in the 5 years that we've done this, both in state court and in federal court. And so that message sends shockwaves through the community. But I think what works best, and Dr. Kennedy will speak to this, the custom notification. So when bad acts happen and we show up the very next day to put them on notice, and then our interrupters are doing the same thing in their way, that really sends shockwaves through the community, that we know who they are and we know what they're doing and we're gathering intelligence on them. And so I'm going to kind of pause for a little bit because I know you want to ask questions, and I know you all are so interested in eating our food and having a few drinks here in the city, and I know you're anxious to get to that.
It's almost evening in New Orleans, definitely, definitely. You want to say something again, Ms. Spencer, before we open up for questions?
That's fine. I will just say that I think it's super. I heard Dr. Slutkin say that public health is the silent partner, and so the silent partner to law enforcement, fire departments, and I think that's exactly what it is. We heard that Professor Kennedy say we need to identify who those high individuals are, those individuals who are those high-risk individuals. And then we also heard from our superintendent, again, identifying and looking at the point of who are those bad actors and making sure that those individuals know that we are aware of the roles that they're playing in communities. And I did have an initial question, but I will pause and actually turn it over to you, Mayor Benjamin.
No, please, ask some more questions.
Thank you. So given all of these different these 2 different methods and models that can be implemented in communities and in cities, why is it that we see the homicide rates and rates of violence increasing across our cities? Please.
Anybody who tells you they know the answer to that, stop listening to them. That's the first thing is. One of the real issues in dealing with violence is the number of people who will tell you they know the answer and what you should do, and they don't know what they're talking about. So there is literally nobody in the country in either law enforcement or criminology who can answer that question with real confidence. It's often a lot easier to say what's not true. And how long have you got on that one, right? So there's a narrative out there that it's social media. There are cities that are continuing the long crime decline. They have Facebook and Instagram too. It's not social media. The guns were already there. The fact that people were coming out of prison and there are reentry issues in your city, that's not new. Yes, they have long criminal records, the victims and offenders. It's always been like that. There is nothing like that in the discourse that has changed in any meaningful way. It looks like the idea that it is associated with the opioid epidemic is probably not right, because so far the markets for opioids are not like crack markets were. They're not open air, they're not highly public, they're not chaotic, it's largely face-to-face. The death issue with opioids is overdose. It does not look right now like it's intentional lethal violence. The two prime candidates on this are the withdrawal of policing, that Ferguson effect. There may be something there, but the more deeply you look, the less that looks like it's true. Mayor Emanuel is with you from Chicago. Stops are way down in Chicago, but gun seizures are way up. The thing that you would expect would actually drive violence reduction. I'm from New York City. Stops are down over 95% from their peak, and violence continues to go down. So there's not that simple link with policing. What a lot of us think, and we can't prove it because we don't have the data, and as Pete Buttigieg here, we were talking about this earlier, a lot of us think it is actually a legitimacy crisis. We know that as community trust in the police and the law go down, especially in these neighborhoods, violence goes up. People don't report, they don't ask for help, they deal with disputes themselves in the way that we've both been talking about. It is a really bad thing when high-risk people lose even more confidence in the police and the system. And there's some good reason to believe that the last couple of years' worth of heightened, ever more intense concern about police violence and greater alienation from the police is driving that divide and creating the conditions in which violence can happen. And this is particularly acute, and we've seen this spiral in Chicago, in Baltimore, high-profile action, high-profile incident that brings these issues to the forefront. You see then the escalation of this violence in the same high-risk networks that we're all talking about, because this stuff feeds on itself and enters into a positive feedback dynamic.
David, thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we have about 20 minutes left of substantive discussion, and you guys have given us a lot to say grace over. I want to make sure we get some of the mayor's questions, and you guys have touched on some really, really important topics. Mayor Soglin, please, Doc, you answer, and mayors, as you asked, remember to introduce yourselves. You said you're from as well. Let's try to keep it all tight, guys, as much as we can.
I want to just add a couple things to this. It is the case that you frequently don't know in epidemics what restarts things. And it's frequently just math, is how many susceptibles there are as compared to how many people are infecting. And this has probably been the reason why, one of the reasons why, over the years, you will see expert economists and criminologists say, we don't understand why, we don't know why, it didn't go with the jobs, et cetera, et cetera. All that having been said, in New York City, where it continues to go down, our work is in 19 communities, and David's work is also all over that city. So there are reasons why, so no matter why, whatever the reasons for an epidemic to go up, if you're putting epidemic control in, you're going to get a drop. I want to add, in Chicago, the violence began to go up in March of 2015, which was when the state of Illinois stopped funding many things, including 13 cure violence sites. And as the exact month is when it started to go up. I'm not saying it's the only factor, but that is exactly when it started to go up. We predicted it because it had happened twice before. And the one neighborhood that had private funding for cure violence continued to go down. And then just to add to what David said, which is also so true and important, but it isn't exactly what we have to do immediately, is that the trust in government, or policing crisis, which, because they're the front end of government, and inequity, are the dirty water as compared to diarrheal epidemics. They're the dirty water. They're what cause it, they're the underlying matter. Nevertheless, in the presence of dirty water, you can get rid of a cholera epidemic.
All right. Mayor Losa?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Mayor Sockman, your question first, then Mayor Losa.
Yeah, I'm going to respect your request to keep it short, though I believe we're about to launch on a discussion that would take hours.
Easily.
I have got as much experience with violence in the city of Chicago as anyone in this room. I was raised in Lawndale. I went to Hyde Park High School. I don't understand. Please tell me how this works with all the shootings, not just in Chicago, but the aura of cities around Chicago in 2 other states, maybe 3, where the homicides are frequently connected to Chicago. How can you say this is working? All I see is, at best, you're doing displacement. Displacement within the city of Chicago, which is tied to housing policies, which is tied to the dislocation of families who are then scattered into other neighborhoods, and it continues.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of data that it's not displacing. In fact, no public health interventions displace. They actually diffuse. And so we showed this early on, that the greatest reduction is in where you do it, and then there's a lesser reduction around it, and so on. But if you go to our website, the Cure Violence website, you'll see a 20-page report on the work of Cure Violence in that city from 2000 to now, with 3 independent evaluations, and how the downs went with the increases in funding. And in 27-08, it went up when the governor and the legislature were fighting with each other, and there was $6 million lost. The same thing happened when there was a contracting problem in 11 and 12. It went up, and the money came back. It went down, and the same time, this thing. All these housing things and all of this stuff, very important, et cetera, et cetera. But the effectiveness of David's intervention, the effectiveness of our intervention, this is what David was talking about, which was also what I was frustrated with when I first came back to the country, is that everyone is thinking that this is due to everything. It's what I call the everything problem. We had this also with AIDS. We had this also with so many other problems, with tuberculosis. It's about the crowding. It's about the bad nutrition. It's about all of these hundreds of other things. No, it isn't. It's about the organism. In this case, it's about exposure. You take, there's a fellow, Spano, who you probably know, who did work in the housing project in Alabama, and he looked at the young kids who were in the worst conditions there were, just as you know them. The schools are awful, and the fathers aren't around, extraordinary poverty, crowding and everything. The young kids who, they and their moms say that they were not exposed to violence, it wasn't done to them. In the next 4 or 5 years, guess what? They're not doing it. But those who were exposed are doing it. And it's dose responsive. It's dose dependent. You take all these conditions, and no one comes in with a cold, no one's getting a cold. You come in with flu, no one, without AIDS, it doesn't show up. The conditions are important, they add susceptibility. They're not the reason for the violence. They're not.
I don't understand. I don't understand the answer. If you look at Chicago over the last 20 years, if you compare Chicago to the rest of the nation, and if, as I said earlier, you look at the aura of Chicago into the surrounding cities as far as Minneapolis, I simply don't see how it works. I do believe that violence and homicides are a public health problem and have to be approached that way. But I simply don't see it working in Chicago.
Let me just very briefly speak to that. We can, because the statistical analyses have gotten really sophisticated now, two things are true, at least associated with the stuff that I've been part of in Chicago. With the parts of these high-risk networks that we've been able to touch, both offending and victimization are way down. And in Gary's terms, the dose just isn't high enough. We haven't been able to do enough work to bring everything down. So you're absolutely right. We're not winning. But we also know that you can make a big difference, and if this were to scale up properly, we could do a lot better. It's not that complicated, really.
I want to add to that from a very practical standpoint. So I understand when you say you don't see it working in Chicago. I can't really speak for Chicago, but what I can say is it's very specific and directed to a group of individuals through data you know are committing a large amount of acts. Now, it's not all individuals, but it's a small group. It's group and gang violence. So it's not all bad actors committing all violence. For us, it's the group and gang violence. And when we identify those high-risk individuals and we can target and go after them, we can provide services to them to offer them a way out of a life. And for every person who takes us up on it, we track them and we can find that there's less recidivism with those individuals. And many of them are not going back into that life when they take us up on the offer. Number two, there's incapacitation. For those that we go after and we catch, they're no longer doing that. And then our street interrupters are helping to prevent some of the violence. So when we look at the number of individuals who are in group and gang violence, committing shootings and homicides, and then we call them in and then we can offer them what they need to get a way and a path away from that violence, we're tracking them. So while it may not stop everybody else from starting violence, those individuals are less likely to commit it. So it's not curing all, but it is very specific and designed for a certain group. And when it's mission specific. With that group of individuals, we can see reductions because we're touching them in every way: enforcement, prevention, and intervention.
Mayor Lorza.
Mayor Lorza from Providence, Rhode Island. And I want to build off of one aspect of the answers to that question. We went through something really interesting recently in Providence. Back in April, we had someone released from prison. So one individual released from prison. 2 months later, in the month of June, we had a very violent month in Providence. There were a lot of retaliatory gang shootings. We know for a fact that this one individual was involved in at least 2 shootings and was shot at least once. But what he did is he ignited this ongoing, years-long, maybe even decades-long feud between 2 different parts of our city. And so it's so interesting how one individual can cause such havoc. This young man was arrested about 3 weeks ago, and as soon as he was arrested, everything calmed down. It's back to normal. So, I mean, that's interesting. We have a street worker program in Providence. We've had it for the past maybe 10 years or so. We don't approach it from sort of consciously from the epidemiological perspective, but everything you mentioned, we call them street workers. They're going out and they're doing this work, and it's driven our homicide and shooting numbers dramatically down. In fact, last year, first year in anyone's memory, we didn't have one single gang-related homicide in all of 2016 in Providence. And so, it's really a testament to what can be done when you're working in conjunction with these groups. My question is, so this one individual, how granular can we be in being able to anticipate who are those folks that are most prone, most likely to pick up a gun and use it? And, even though we have these programs, we can't reach everyone, but what does it take to reach those individuals, and how granular do we have to be in being able to anticipate who's most likely to cause, this tinderbox to explode?
You want to, I do too. Extremely granular is what turns out to be the answer. Everything that you're hearing about from both of us is a work in progress, and thankfully, although none of it is where we would like to be, it gets better and better and better and better. And please go home and say hello to my friend Juan Carter, who runs your center now. we've learned a tremendous amount from him and from the Institute. So Superintendent Harrison can tell you that NOPD now does something on a weekly basis or so that we call a shooting review. And in nearly the busiest jurisdictions, the stuff we're talking about, Chicago being an exception, but in most places, as bad as this stuff is, the number of homicides and shootings that we're dealing with are not so great that if you get everybody who knows about them and about the streets together, same place, same time, same rooms, same people, weekly, and say what happened since the last time we had this conversation, you can get very, very close to the micro dynamics of what's going on. And this stuff is reciprocal. It's got all kinds of loopiness and retaliation in it. You can identify that right away. Police and community and social service providers and churches can figure out how to reach in and touch and affect that dynamic. And it's not at all out of the ordinary now for people in that room, if the right folks are represented, to say, hey, by the way, that guy's about to come out of lockup. We know who he is. And we don't have an algorithm that's going to tell us this. This is what we do. And when he hit the streets, there's going to be trouble. What are we going to do about that? And you actually can get ahead of this stuff.
I mean, we call this stopping violence it's called on the front end. And if you have a group of workers, interrupters and outreach workers on the street, what are they doing all day? What they're doing is hanging out and saying, hey, how's everything? What's going on? Everyone knows they're interrupters. They're not undercover people. They're interrupters. And someone will say, you know, there was really a mess at the party. These two guys left early, and they're really hot. They're really mad. They're going to do something. They'll tell the workers about their friends because they're trying to cool their friends down, and they don't have all of the skills and whatnot. We will get calls. You know, my friend is going to do an armed robbery. We'll get a call from a mom. My son is loading weapons downstairs with his friends. She doesn't want to call the police, or she doesn't know what to do. She's at wit's end. So these guys get calls and are told who's upset about what, whether they're going to do a shooting or even if it's a slightly lesser thing. And they're mediating so much stuff even beyond what we're talking about today, because there's things happening in the home to mom or to their sister. You know, there's abuse cases going on in the home that because they're the people on the street who are trusted, they're being asked to help out with this and with this and with this, all this stuff. Someone was threatened, you know, that if you ever come back to school, I'll kill you. So this guy has been out of school for 2 years. You know, hiding in the basement part of the time or most of the time. And so we negotiate him to get back into school and stuff like that. So they're they're helping in all of these particular ways, but their primary goal is to make sure nothing happens. I went into Cherry Hill, Baltimore with our board a few years ago. I don't know if you were there or what. And they had no shootings and no killings for 450 days. Cherry Hill is a notorious place. And so it's like, okay, everything's cool, everything's cool. So then someone asked the question, you know, what did you do last night? These guys are so busy keeping everything cool. You know, it takes a little longer for all the norms to fully change.
I want to give Mayor Ganem and then Mayor Freeman Wilson and then Mayor Fisher. All right, those will be our last three. And the good thing about this, because obviously we're getting a lot of great information today. This is going to inform our policy priorities discussion tomorrow as well. So this will feed right into tomorrow, but we're going to wrap this up in a little bit. So you guys, let's keep it tight. Ganem and Karen, and pull your microphone over.
Yeah, thanks. I was asking.
Thank you, brother.
Mayor Wilson, how much overlap or redundancy is there with Project Longevity, which is what we have? It sounds very familiar, but you sound like you have great success. Are you familiar with Project Longevity? That term?
It's exactly what we're talking about.
Okay.
So my office has been working with the state of Connecticut and Hartford, Bridgeport, New Haven on longevity. It is precisely what we're talking about.
So okay, that's good. I can catch with you afterwards. Thank you.
That's a good point, too. All of our subject matter experts will be here afterwards, too. Mayor Freeman Wilson Police, who's done great work on all of our criminal justice policy the last several years, a great leader.
I appreciate the opportunity to hear your presentations, and thank you for all of your work. I want to particularly thank David Kennedy for his work in the city of Gary. I have a question. A lot of what you've talked about is about people who have already embarked on their life of violence. How much coordination is there in the communities that you've worked in with prevention efforts that are really directed at keeping kids from embarking on or even engaging in their first violent act?
I don't think either of our work is primarily focused on that. Would you agree with that? At the same time, these interrupters and outreach workers, this is one of 3 or 4 things that to me was very unexpected. They're now being looked up to. People want to grow up to be an interrupter. And they're picking up, there have been a couple studies looking at them, and it may be that their norms are changing and their thinking is changing, but it's not so much that we're interacting with them directly for that. I should say that there is a school connection with this as well. And it's because the community stuff spills into the school and the school stuff causes problems that spill into the community. So interrupters are frequently, and outreach workers are frequently interacting with the school to do some kind of guidance, and it's also about being informed so that you could cool things down. So we're not going that far into that space, but I do think it helps for the transformation. The transformation comes from the leading edge. See, treatment is the cure. This happens also for TB. It happens with a lot of things. It's also the case for opioids. Working with those who are most infected, if you permit those words, that is the most important thing to do, and it reverberates back. I mean, just imagine the kid in school who's looking out the window at who's getting attention and who's getting girls for what. And then that what is now different. See what I'm saying?
I think it's critically important that you not just rely on focused deterrence or this other model. The city's administration, along with the police department, along with whatever community policing initiatives you would have in your city, are critically important to get to kids at a younger age to have initiatives that give them opportunities, that put them in front of positive role models who, by the way, work for the city, who work for your police department, who work in the community, to constantly work with them on prevention, whether it's in athletics, whether it's in arts, whether it's in academics, cultural things, social things, whatever it is. I think it's important that any city that adopts one of these models takes it upon itself through whatever community policing or community engagement activities to reach kids and host them and put them in front of the positive role models, positive influence, and talk about these models to them so that they understand that should they choose to become in a life of crime, these are the consequences for those actions. But should you participate in these community engagement efforts with us, here's the path to a life of success, a life without crime, showing them what that looks like. I think it's important that if you adopt any model, you have to have that community engagement, both from your police department and from your city administration.
All right. Mayor Fisher. Do you have something to say, Mr. Kennedy? Mayor Fisher.
Yeah, Greg Fisher from Louisville. So we're using parts of your programs, attempting to in our city. I'm either in the jail or our youth detention center probably once a month, but in our youth detention center in particular, when you ask the kids, what's happening, why are you here, probably 3/4 of the time, it was something that started on social media. So I've got a question for you. One, if you could describe any social media battling techniques, and then on a more practical level, what do you see as the compensation level for your interrupters where you can get good stability with them staying with the system, and does it matter whether or not they're employed by the city or a third party? So 2 questions.
I'll take the first one, and there is absolutely no question that communication on social media is a big part of what's going on right now. I think the jury's out, and we should be very skeptical about jumping to the conclusion, which most of us are these days, that social media is fueling this in a new and different way and that it's making it worse, because it's not at all clear that that's true. If you'd had that same conversation with those same kids 20 years ago, they would have said, we're in here because our gangs are beefing and it was provoked by graffiti. And after that, it was the rap mixtapes, and then it was the video studios, and now it's social media. The dynamics haven't changed. The dynamics have always been norms around beef and respect and disrespect within these very high-risk networks. The modes in which the information moves around have changed, but it's really not clear that it's making anything worse or that it's fundamentally altering what's going on. And it's also true that in most of our cities, we've got stable violence levels. In a lot of places, of course, they've been going down for a long time. We've got some now where we're seeing these spikes. All of them have social media. That's not different across the country. So I believe we should be really cautious about thinking that social media is driving something new and different. I don't think it is. And then you can talk to comment.
I don't think that there are spikes or changes in the trends that can be attributed to the social media experience. But our staff in multiple cities are paying very, very close attention to this. And I mean, there are things that are going off because of people with, gang banging or threatening on social media. And so, I mean, people are, late at night drunk and showing what a man they are or something, and and threatening someone, not physically, but through social media. And people are getting killed because of a social media boast or threat. It's certainly happening. I know this. I know cases. Our staff, so I didn't actually get into this, so a team might have 10 people or 12 people, maybe 4 or 5 of them are interrupters, the rest of them are outreach workers who are carrying a caseload for this period of extended time of trying to change these very high-risk people and so on. They are monitoring the social media of them and their friends like crazy. Facebook, Instagram, and so on. They are watching it all the time and interrupting either through the social media or being alerted to something that's going to go off because of that. And we're trying some different ways. I've got one guy just on innovation around this to find stuff even quicker in that space. And on the compensation, I mean, these guys have to be paid. They're being paid ordinarily between 30 and 35. Supervisors paid more, and managers paid, into the middle 40s or high 40s. So there's different, and then the hospital responders are also in the mid-30s, sometimes slightly higher.
And
this cannot be done by volunteers on a continuous basis.
Does it matter if they work directly for the city or third party, or in terms of their respect or trust on the street?
The best thing is that they're seen as employees of the community itself. And so ordinarily, the best structural arrangement for this, which is, I think, in Baltimore and in New York City, that the health department is overseeing this and guiding this, and that there's a network of community groups that have been there forever that are very carefully selected for a certain number of criteria, being able to work with this population, work nights, manage money, and so on, and that, and so that they're not seen as cure violence, they're not seen as health department, they're seen as, insiders. Yeah.
Guys, I want to thank Michelle. Go ahead, please.
I wanted to just add
you
to
get the
that
last word. You're the
about
chief of
social-
police. You get the last word here.
About social media. I think what chiefs around the country are seeing is social media in and of itself may not be attributing to an increase in violence, but it is certainly making it easier for perpetrators to know where their victims are going to be, because they're tracking each other constantly. So when one person is saying, I'm at a party, he has made it easier for the person who wants to get him to know where he is. So we're seeing that, more of that around the country. And as we talk, we're finding that a lot of our evidence is coming from people posting where they are, what they're doing, and when the bad act happens at that place, it's because he telegraphed where he or she was. That we're seeing an increase of, but not social media by itself being the reason for the increase.
But if there's interrupters, that event would not have happened, because we would have been tracking that and seen that this guy was out there. Do you see what I'm saying? So here, this is evidence, but it's better to not have evidence. In other words, that something didn't happen.
On behalf of Mayor Landrieu, I want to thank everyone. Thank Michelle and David, Gary, and Superintendent Harrison, and what they call my colleagues too. This has been a long day. This has been a long day, 10 hours strong, in one of the most beautiful, historic, charming, and entertaining cities in the entire world. We've been indoors, focusing on the myriad issues facing our communities. There's a reason that America's cities are thriving right now. It's because of leaders like each and every one of you who've been taking in data and evidence, programs and policies and practices that are helping change and improve the lives of the people that we represent. So I think let's give our panel a round of applause, please. Very brief housekeeping tonight. Buses are going to be leaving starting at 6:45 for the Taste of New Orleans celebration at the Orpheum Theater. We will not be in this room tomorrow, so if you want to keep your stuff, take it with you. I think we'll be a couple of doors down, and we're going to dive forehead deep tomorrow morning, breakfast at 8 a.m. and talking policy at 9 tomorrow morning. But thank you, all of you, for your hard work today and wonderful, engaging conversations. God bless you. A non-debatable motion to adjourn passes. Thank you.